The storm winds howled across the battlements of Winterfell in the dead of night, raking the castle walls with a merciless roar. Eddard Stark stood upon the ramparts, his cloak heavy with snow, his breath turning to frost the instant it left his lips. He could sense the heart of the north trembling in the wind. His brown hair, whipped by the gale, clung damply to his forehead, and he narrowed his gray eyes against flakes of new snow riding the night's cold breath. There was a feeling inside him, a low, insistent dread that the world was shifting. A man of duty and honor, Eddard rarely let fear find any quarter in his heart, but tonight he felt the icy prickle of something beyond mortal storms. In that moment, he wondered if the old tales were no longer tales at all. He had come to see the messenger from the distant gift, an older man with shuddering hands and eyes like polished stones. The man's lips were blue, whether from the chill or from the news he bore, and each word had emerged from his mouth as if carved from frozen rock. "The White Walkers," he whispered. "The others. Creatures of living ice who commanded the dead. They had come." Eddard did not want to believe it. He had listened politely, pressed for details, tried to glean some sense behind these impossible claims, but the messenger was half out of his mind with terror. Then he died before the next dawn, dead from a chill that went beyond the wind and the snow, as though the fear itself had killed him. Eddard Stark had little time to dwell on the matter, for the realm was in turmoil. King Aerys Targaryen still reigned in the south, though his hold was slipping, locked in the throes of war against Lord Robert Baratheon. A rebellion sparked after Prince Rhaegar allegedly absconded with Lyanna Stark, Ned's beloved sister. The realm had seen enough bloodshed under the Dragon King, men burned alive, suspicions of treachery, vile acts rumored in the dungeons of the Red Keep. The loyal houses that stood with Robert, House Stark, House Tully, House Arryn, had the support of some in the west, and soon the tide might well break against House Targaryen for good. Yet now, in the midst of this war, whispers were carried on the frosty gusts. An ancient enemy had returned. Every wind that blew from the far northern horizon carried rumors that made warriors blanch. Men claimed to have seen corpses walk. Wildlings, when captured at the wall, babbled about pale spiders as large as hounds, about an icy wind that turned the air to shards. The Night's Watch was said to be pressed thin. Even so, the southern lords, locked in their great battles and courtly intrigues, did not heed such talk. They had never believed the old legends. The others had been gone for thousands of years, banished by the dawn of a new age. Or so everyone said. Eddard, raised with the measured stoicism of the north, never fully denied the possibility of dark powers. But even he had not truly believed it. Until the day the dying messenger arrived. Winterfell stood as a fortress of stone and tradition, cloaked in the stark quiet that preceded storms. The high towers and old walls, the sprawling godwood, the hot springs that coiled steam through the courtyard, this ancient seat of House Stark had seen centuries pass, had survived rebellions, famine, and the savage bite of more than one long winter. But it had not felt fear. Not like this. Eddard turned away from the ramparts, descending a stair that curled between the outer battlements and a secluded walkway. His boots felt unsteady on the frost-slick steps. He could not banish the messenger's trembling voice from his memory. By the time he reached the courtyard, the wind had begun to abate, but snow still fell in a persistent hush, layering the flagstones. A stable boy hurried past, head lowered, cloak plastered to his back by the damp. Passing inside, Eddard made his way toward the great hall. The warmth of the fires was a relief, and yet he could not shed the cold feeling coiling around his heart. Inside, a group of his bannermen waited. Ser Helman Tallheart stood near a column, his shoulders broad under a fur-lined doublet. Lord Wyman Manderley of White Harbor was seated, red-faced from the chill but with keen blue eyes. Roose Bolton lingered farther off, his face pale and unreadable as ever, though a faint line of disquiet on his brow suggested even he was disturbed by recent tidings. Eddard joined them, feeling the weight of their collective stares. They wanted answers. They wanted a path forward. Where should the North place its strength? Should they commit more men to the Southern Rebellion? Or was there a dire threat looming from beyond the wall? Eddard motioned for a steward to pour him a cup of hot spiced wine. He took a sip, the heat sliding down his throat, and wished it could warm his troubled thoughts. "My lords," he said quietly, "I thank you for gathering so late. The roads grow treacherous with the snows, but the realm offers us no respite." Lord Wyman tugged at the folds of his heavy cloak. "Is it true, then? The White Walkers have been seen." "Aye," Eddard replied. "Or so the messenger claimed. He spoke of dead men rising, of ice and darkness. Then he perished before I could glean more. But the Night's Watch has sent ravens to Winterfell. They've lost rangers. They speak of an uprising of wildlings unlike any in living memory. My brother Benjen took the Black as soon as the rebellion began, but even he has not written to me in weeks. The air itself seems to have turned malevolent. Roose Bolton let his dark eyes settle on Eddard's face. And in the south, Robert's rebellion rages on, my lord. But I wonder, is it truly wise to think of the others as more than a story? We have war enough at our doorstep, and the Targaryens will be as merciless as the frost if they think we hesitate. Eddard's jaw set. I have no love for the Targaryen throne. Yet the entire realm may be undone if these creatures truly walk again. He paused, looking at them one by one. We cannot pretend to know for certain, but we must heed the warnings. If the White Walkers have returned, all armies in the south would be meaningless. The living must stand together. Lord Wyman's jowls quivered. We should act swiftly, my lord. Perhaps call the banners. Raise the North's full host. We march to the wall and see for ourselves. And leave the rebellion to flounder? Ser Helman Tallheart asked. We are honor-bound. Prince Rhaegar stole Lady Lyanna. King Aerys murdered Lord Rickard and Brandon. Are we to let the Dragon King roam free of retribution? Eddard felt the old anguish in his chest at the mention of his father and brother. They had died in King's Landing, victims of the Mad King's wrath. Robert's rebellion was their rightful vengeance, and, more than that, it was the only path to a realm free of Aerys' tyranny. There was no easy decision. On the one hand, the tide of war drew them south. On the other, the North itself might face a threat more awful than any mortal tyrant. He glanced at the ancient face of the direwolf sigil on the wall and said, We will do both if we must. The North is vast. Many swords remain to be called upon. If these White Walkers are more than myth, we have no choice. Our existence is at stake. Robert is my friend, and I pledge to him, but I will not abandon our own lands to an enemy that belongs in nightmares. He asked them to hold council. They debated until the fires in the hall burned low, until exhaustion etched their voices. By dawn, a plan was made. Eddard would ride forth to the wall with a contingent of northern bannermen. He would see the threat for himself, meet with the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and verify the truth behind these rumors. Meanwhile, a large portion of the North's forces, led by Roose Bolton, Ser Helman, and Lord Wyman, would prepare to move south as pledged, reinforcing Robert's cause as soon as feasible. If the threat from the far north proved false or minimal, Eddard would ride south after seeing his own lands secured. If it were real, they would have to pray their men were not too deeply entangled in the southern conflict to turn back in time. It was not a perfect solution, but war seldom allowed perfection. They parted, heavy with unease, and Eddard retreated to the quiet of his solar. There he found his wife, Catelyn. She was sitting beside the fire, her hands folded in her lap. When she looked at him, he saw the sorrow of the times reflected in her tully blue eyes. She asked if the rumors were true. He told her as much as he knew. She lowered her gaze. You mean to leave again? It was not a question. He had ridden south to help raise armies for the rebellion. He had returned only recently to see Winterfell stable in his absence, only to face this new threat. He bent to press a tender kiss to her brow. I must. The wall is not so far, and if these creatures from old tales truly come, I cannot leave the Night's Watch to face them alone. House Stark has guarded the North for generations. Catelyn nodded, though worry touched her voice. Go swiftly and return quickly, my lord. Our children need their father. War is no place for them. Eddard promised he would return, but in truth he did not know how swift or how simple his journey might be. Outside, the storm gathered its strength, and the promise of winter was in the air. Within 2 days, Eddard assembled a chosen band of 300 men, an escort that included seasoned warriors, trackers, and even a few maesters. They rode out from Winterfell in a grim column. The snow muffled the hoofbeats and made each breath visible in the air like ghosts carried along with them. Robb Stark, his firstborn son, barely past infancy, remained safe in Winterfell. The parting stung Eddard's heart, but he reminded himself that he rode north to protect them all, to guard the realm from an unimaginable evil. As they advanced, the roads became increasingly inhospitable. In places, the drifts reached the girths of their horses. Even the hardy men of the North swore under their breath at the freezing wind that scoured their faces. The high gray sky rarely parted to show the sun, and Eddard thought it odd that the weather had grown this fierce so early in the year. It was not yet the fullness of winter, but the cold was so intense that he sometimes worried for the weaker among them. At the same time, the road was eerily vacant. They passed abandoned holdfasts, small villages where not a single soul lingered, the doors of huts broken open and snow drifting inside. The men muttered that it was unnatural even if the wildlings were said to be prowling in greater numbers. It was as if the countryside had emptied. As they drew nearer the last hearth, seat of Houseumber, Eddard hoped to find solace and additional men to add to his party. Yet, upon arriving, they found a tense and anxious household. Lord Great John Umber greeted them in the yard, cursing the gods for the dire portents. "More than half my small folk have fled south," the Great John said, stomping in the snow with enough force to shake it from his boots. "They heard tales that the dead roam. Hell, I never thought I'd see the day when farmers left their land in winter. Fools or wise men, I can't say. Are you truly heading for the wall, Lord Stark? Have you heard from the Night's Watch?" Eddard nodded. "We go to see for ourselves. Will you join us?" The Great John was never one to flee from a challenge. "Aye," he roared, "I'll send men. But mark me, Ned Stark, if there are others beyond the wall, I intend to rip their hearts out. If they even have hearts." He spat into the snow, his breath steaming. They spent a night at the last hearth, warm for a few hours at least in the smoky confines of the Great Hall. The Umbers added a fresh company of fierce warriors, tall and broad like the Great John himself, many of them cousins or distant kin of his line. That swelling of their ranks gave Eddard a measure of comfort as they pressed on. Northward they went, day by day, the temperature dropping as if they rode into the heart of an endless winter. The nights lengthened. Under the dim gray sky, some men spoke of hearing strange sounds in the wind, echoes that sounded like cries of torment. Others claimed to see shapes out on the plains, half hidden by blowing snow. Once they came upon a cluster of dead wildlings near a frozen stream. Their bodies were twisted in positions of agony, their eyes wide, their flesh seemingly untouched by rot. The sight made some men retch behind the trees. Eddard's heart hammered, for the rumors grew more tangible with each league. Finally, the high black shape of the wall rose on the horizon. That immense barrier of ice seemed to scrape the clouds as though daring the heavens to overshadow it. Far above, ravens circled in the chilly wind. The fortress of Castle Black was gloomier than Eddard ever remembered. The gates opened to admit him, and he was greeted with nods and quick salutes from black-clad sentinels who recognized his stark face. At once he asked for the Lord Commander, hoping for swift news. They found the Lord Commander, an older, barrel-chested man with white hair, standing near a brazier, reading a parchment by flickering firelight. His gaze lifted as Eddard entered. "Lord Stark," the commander said. "I expected you might come. We've had ravens from Winterfell, from the Shadow Tower, from Eastwatch, from every corner that remains. You seek news of these unnatural sightings. I'm afraid it's no rumor." Eddard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He closed the door against the wind, and his guards lingered in the hall. "Tell me everything, Lord Commander." The older man inhaled a breath that rattled in his throat. "Our rangers have seen them. At first, a single group, pale shapes in the snow, with eyes as bright as blue stars. The wildlings are fleeing in droves, Mance Rayda's got them scattering. I fear entire villages are lost. The men speak of whites, corpses that walk. We had a small patrol vanish beyond the wall, only to return days later, changed. They attacked their brothers. Now we keep a wary watch every night. Fire is our only sure weapon. But we haven't the men to hold them back, not if they strike in force." Eddard had known it was bad, but not this dire. The realm was at war with itself while an enemy of nightmares crept ever closer from the frozen wastes. He asked about Benjen Stark, his younger brother. The Lord Commander shook his head. "Ranger Benjen took a patrol some weeks ago, heading to investigate rumors of a White Walker near a wildling camp. He hasn't returned, my lord. We fear the worst, yet we still hope. He was a fine ranger. Better than most." Grief twisted in Eddard's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I must find him. Dead or alive. He is my brother, and I will not abandon him to the cold." The commander's gaze was grim. "We cannot stop you. But I'd counsel caution, Lord Stark. The others are out there, and they do not attack alone." That evening, Eddard met with his bannermen who had come this far, as well as senior members of the Night's Watch, First Ranger, Master-at-Arms, a few stewards who knew the ground. Together, they discussed how best to confirm the location of these White Walkers and if a rescue of any missing rangers was still possible. Some men proposed a large sortie beyond the wall, a show of northern steel. Others argued for smaller scouting parties to slip in quietly. In the end, a compromise emerged, a scouting force of sturdy, capable warriors with enough men to face a threat but not so many as to be unwieldy. Eddard insisted on leading them. He was not a man to sit idle behind walls of ice while others risked their lives. And the rumor of his brother's fate weighed upon his heart. At dawn, they marched through the gate in the wall that led to the wild, frigid lands beyond. The wind whipped snow in swirling eddies, and the forest of the haunted north, the taiga that folk called the haunted forest, loomed black and silent. The trees wore mantles of white. Ravens cawed overhead, disturbed by the intrusion of men. Eddard's men kept swords drawn and torches lit, the hiss of flame mingling with the low moan of the wind. They ventured deeper until the wall was a distant memory behind them, lost beyond the mounds of drifted snow. The shadows grew dense, and the day's meager light did little to reassure them. Now and again, they spied the remains of wildling camps, burned hovels, broken spears, footprints half filled by fresh snow. Sometimes they saw no sign of conflict at all, simply empty shelters and the faint sense that something dreadful had happened. The haunted hush lingered. Near midday, the scouts found fresh tracks. Footprints in the snow, ragged around the edges but clearly belonging to men. The pattern was strange, shuffled, staggering, as though those who made them were not fully alive. Eddard's companions found drag marks too, as if something was pulled or carried. Blood spattered the snow in places, small black drops. The sight made Eddard's stomach tighten. He signaled for quiet, and they advanced, hugging the tree line until they came upon a clearing. There they saw them. A half-dozen shapes staggering slowly through the pale gloom. At first glance, they looked like men, wildlings perhaps, clad in ragged furs. But as Eddard's eyes adjusted, he saw the unnatural pallor of their skin, the vacant glow in their eyes. They were dead. Corpses. And they walked. Whites. The men around him shifted in horror, but none dared speak. One white paused and turned its head as though sensing the warmth of living bodies nearby. Its face had been partially frozen, the flesh blackened in patches. Yet there was no question that it moved of its own volition, with a silent, malignant purpose. Eddard felt his pulse thunder in his ears. Here was the truth he had once doubted, laid out plainly. The legends were real. The living dead stalked these lands at the behest of beings older and crueler than men. The next moment, one of the whites let out a rasping hiss, a sound that chilled the blood. It pointed a skeletal hand in their direction. The entire group of undead turned as one. "Burn them," Eddard ordered, voice tight. His men rushed forward with torches, swords at the ready. The whites came on in a clumsy yet unervingly relentless shuffle. Steel alone was no sure guarantee against these abominations, but severing limbs or bashing skulls might slow them. Fire was better. A pair of whites collapsed under a volley of arrows to the knees, yet even from the ground they clawed at the air, eyes burning with cold fire. Another rushed a man whose sword merely glanced off half-frozen bone. The soldier cried out, stumbling, only to be saved by an umberman who hacked the white's head from its shoulders with a great axe. Still the severed head snapped its jaws until a torch was thrust into the decaying maw, flame-devouring foul flesh in a burst of acrid smoke. Eddard himself faced one of the creatures, striking it with ice, his Valyrian steel greatsword. The blow bit deep, and in the pale gloom he saw the white's eyes flicker. It dropped in pieces, yet even parted from its arms, it tried to push forward with half its body. He signaled a man carrying a torch, and they set it alight. The stench was unbearable, but Eddard forced himself to endure. Soon the clearing was thick with the smoke of burning corpses. When at last the threat was ended, they gathered themselves, hearts pounding. A few men nursed wounds, but none were direly hurt thanks to Eddard's quick orders. In hushed voices, they acknowledged the horror of what they had witnessed. This was no rumor. Eddard prayed silently to the old gods to keep them strong. They pressed on, more cautious now, torches kept close at hand even by day. The sun hung low, a pale orb behind the gray cloud, and the forest around them was as quiet as the grave. Occasionally they glimpsed fleeting shapes in the distance, perhaps more whites or living wildlings. Whatever the cause, they were not eager to draw attention unless necessary. Dusk found them near the slopes of a ridge that overlooked a valley choked with pines. They made a cold camp amid the roots of a stand of gnarled trees, building small fires and setting a watch rotation. Eddard could see the fear in his men's eyes. No one wanted to sleep, lest the dead come creeping in the night. Nor did Eddard rest easy. He sat with his back against a trunk, ice across his knees, listening to the moaning wind and half expecting to see that cold blue glow moving through the dark. He dozed fitfully, haunted by dreams of faces he loved turned pale and dead. He saw Brandon, his older brother, burning with that same baleful flame in his eyes, arms outstretched, beckoning him into the darkness. He dreamt of Lyanna as well, lying in a bed of blood and whispering warnings he could not understand. He dreamt of Robert, hammer in hand, bellowing a war cry against an army of the dead. And beyond them all loomed the chilling figure of a White Walker, tall, gaunt, its skin like moonlit ice, its eyes glowing blue. In the dream, it raised a sword of crystalline frost, pointing it at Eddard as if to claim him body and soul. When he awoke, sweat had frozen on his brow and the first flush of dawn tinted the east. They traveled another 2 days deeper into the wild, searching for clues of Benjen Stark or the main host of the others. The signs were ominous. More dead wildlings, more evidence of wights. Patches of the land were unnaturally cold as though drained of warmth by the presence of something malevolent. They found a wolf pack slaughtered with savage precision, the corpses strewn about in strange patterns. It was as though the White Walkers left these grisly markers to instill terror in mortal hearts. At last, near twilight, their scouting party crested a rise and looked upon a broad frozen river. It glimmered faintly under the sullen sky. Smoke rose from beyond a bend, a thin column. Approaching cautiously, they discovered the charred remains of a wildling village. What huts still stood were riddled with ragged holes. Corpses, both of men and women, lay scattered on the ice, some missing limbs. The tracks suggested they might have turned on one another before the end. Or perhaps something else had orchestrated the carnage. One survivor huddled against a fallen tree, a wildling woman with matted hair. She stared at them in terror, brandishing a broken spear. She was half-starved, bruised, her cheeks hollow. Eddard motioned for his men to lower their weapons. He approached carefully, pulling down his cloak hood to show he meant no harm. "What happened here?" he asked gently. She shivered, not from the cold alone. She murmured a name, what sounded like Igrin or Ergla, and tried to speak in the rough dialect of the free folk. Gradually, she managed to convey fragments of her story. The dead had come. The White Walkers. Icy demons that led an army of corpses. The village had tried to flee. Some turned on others in their panic. She had hidden until morning. Now she was alone. When Eddard asked about any rangers, a man named Stark, she shook her head. She had not seen them. Eddard gave her some food and a water skin, though it might not be enough to sustain her for long. She refused to come with them, muttering something about not trusting crows or kneelers. Then she fled into the woods like a frightened deer. Eddard did not stop her. He offered a silent prayer that she would survive. If the others roamed freely, no place was truly safe. That night, the moon was an icy sliver overhead, faint through the clouds. Eddard's men set out double watch. He was dozing near the embers of their fire when the alarm went up, a distant shout, then a horn blast that echoed through the timber. Eddard scrambled to his feet, grabbing ice and a torch from a comrade. Men rushed about in confusion. Past the tree line, the forest seemed alive with movement. A figure burst into the glow of their campfires, a Night's Watch ranger, battered, bleeding from a deep gash in his arm. He half collapsed at Eddard's feet. "They're coming," he gasped. "White Walkers. I saw them." Benjen Stark, taken, then he fainted. Before Eddard could even comprehend that horrifying statement, movement flickered at the edge of the trees. Tall shapes, slender yet inhumanly graceful, emerged from the darkness. Their flesh shone with the pallor of ice, their eyes a frost-blue luminescence. White Walkers. Each carried a weapon that glimmered like pale crystal, forging a high keening sound when swung through the air. Behind them, hunched silhouettes loomed, whites, a mass of them, stumbling forward like puppets on unseen strings. "Form ranks," Eddard shouted. The men clustered into a defensive circle, torches held high, swords and axes ready. Fear surged in many hearts, but desperation drove them. They would not die without a fight. The first White Walker advanced with otherworldly swiftness. Its sword clashed with a steel blade, but the steel cracked on contact, frozen by unnatural cold. A second White Walker circled around, raising its icy spear at a man from Houseumber. He tried to deflect the blow, but the spear cut through cloak and fur as if they were paper, slicing into flesh that froze at once, the man's cry choking in his throat. Another man tried to hurl a torch at one of the White Walkers, but the creature moved with blinding agility, turning aside as if the flames themselves shied away from it. Eddard took in the chaos. They were outmatched in pure skill and terror. But still, a few whites went down under steel and flame. The White Walkers, though, were not so easily bested. Two of them glided closer to Eddard, silent malice in their luminous eyes. He raised ice, cursing the fact that he did not have Dragoglass or Valyrian steel in every hand. He tried to remember the old tales. The others hated dragon steel, they hated fire. But he had only one Valyrian blade among them. Stepping forward, he gave a mighty swing at the nearest White Walker. The creature dodged with inhuman grace, its frosty sword flicking out in a counterstrike. Eddard barely parried in time. Even so, the shock of the impact vibrated up his arms with a burning cold that nearly forced him to drop ice. Their men fought valiantly. The Umbers roared, hacking at whites, driving them back with torch and steel. Another group tried to encircle one of the White Walkers but found themselves scattered by the creature's eerie quickness. It moved like a dancer upon fresh snow, each strike felling a man or sending him sprawling. Where it passed, frost crept across the ground, a lethal halo of cold. Eddard gritted his teeth, launching another blow. Ice cut a shallow line across the walker's torso. Pale ichor hissed, steaming in the cold air. The walker recoiled, eyes flaring with unnatural fury. With swift vengeance, it lashed out, forcing Eddard back. He sensed movement behind him, another walker creeping close. He pivoted, raising ice just as the second walker thrust its spear. The blade glanced off the Valyrian steel, sending shards of frost swirling. Eddard stumbled but held his footing. The white fury in front of him advanced again. Then a sudden blast of flame lit the darkness as several men hurled lit torches into the fray. One torch landed at the walker's feet, momentarily distracting it. Eddard seized the chance, swinging ice in a powerful arc that took the walker's head clean from its shoulders. A shriek like shattering glass rent the air. The White Walker's body dissolved into shards that evaporated in an eerie hiss, leaving a patch of white powder on the snow. For a heartbeat, the swirling ice crystals hung in the air, then fell silent. Eddard's arms burned from effort, but he wasted no time spinning to face the next threat. The second walker hissed, but seemed momentarily unnerved by the demise of its kin. Another man thrust a torch at it, forcing it to step back. In that instant, Eddard slashed. Again came that shriek and the walker's end. But more whites pressed forward, macabre puppets. Men fought them desperately, slashing, burning, smashing them into motionless bits. One more White Walker advanced, thinning the circle of defenders. Eddard rushed in, ignoring the fear thrumming in his veins. He and the men managed to trap the creature between torches and Valyrian steel. They vanquished it, but at a cost. 2 more men lay dead, their eyes staring sightlessly, their skin rimed with frost. The air reeked of burning flesh and rotted decay. At last, as quickly as the attack began, the White Walkers withdrew. The whites that remained collapsed in heaps, robbed of the controlling will. The night was still, save for the ragged breathing of the living. Eddard scanned the bodies, mourning the fallen. The ground was littered with bloodied shapes. Those that breathed clutched wounds that might yet kill them, or that might do worse if some foul magic lingered. In the faint moonlight, Eddard dropped to a knee, chest heaving. They had survived. But the cost was high, and his brother Benjen was nowhere among them. When the hush settled, he recalled the battered ranger who had stumbled in with news that Benjen had been taken. Eddard rushed to the man's side. The ranger lay on the snow, propped by another watchman. His eyes fluttered open at Eddard's approach. "Benjen Stark," he rasped. "We were captured by the others, or whatever they are. They keep some men alive for reasons unknown. He told me to run. So I did." He coughed, spitting blood. "They took him north, deeper, said something about an army. They want to cross the wall." Eddard felt a torrent of conflicting emotions. It was madness. The others wanted to breach the wall. They had his brother. Time was running out, and each day of the rebellion in the south gave these creatures more room to gather their undead forces. If the realm remained divided, it would surely fall. He gathered what remained of the scouting party, tended the wounded as best they could. In the cold light of dawn, they decided to head back to the wall. Their party was diminished, battered. They had gleaned knowledge both precious and terrible that the White Walkers were massing an army, that they wanted to cross the wall, that they might be holding Benjen Stark. This was no small threat or isolated menace. It was a war for the living. The return to Castle Black was a miserable march of sorrow and numb exhaustion. They carried the bodies of some who had fallen, determined to give them what funeral rites they could. The men walked in near silence, minds weighed by what they had witnessed. Even the great John, normally boisterous, strode with a grim set to his jaw. When the black ice of the wall finally came into view, Eddard felt neither relief nor comfort, merely the knowledge that they had reached the threshold of civilization. On the other side lay a realm unprepared for what was coming. They arrived at Castle Black and summoned the Lord Commander. Eddard recounted the battle, the whites, the White Walkers, and the dire news about Benjen. As the Lord Commander listened, his face grew steadily paler. He rubbed a scar on his cheek, his voice low when he spoke. "If they truly mean to cross, they will test every inch of our defenses. And if they have force enough, they may breach the wall or find a way around it, through the water or through black sorcery. The watch is too few to hold them at every turn. And the lords south of the neck are busy fighting each other. We must warn them," Eddard said. "All the lords, all the kings, all the would-be usurpers. This is beyond houses and blood feuds. The living must unite. The war in the south must end, or we are all doomed." The Lord Commander exhaled, the lines of age on his face deepening. "Aye, but will they listen? Eddard remembered Robert Baratheon, the rebellious fire that burned in his friend. Robert was not a fool, nor was Jon Arryn. They might heed the warning if Eddard could convince them. But as for the Targaryens, King Aerys, if he was still enthroned, would rather see the world burn. Rhaegar might have been more rational, but the bitterness of war might blind him to any pleas from the rebels. Still, there was no choice. Eddard had to try. That very evening, Eddard penned urgent messages. He wrote to Moat Cailin, to Winterfell, to the Vale, to Riverrun, to Storm's End, to the Lannisters at Casterly Rock, even to King's Landing. Each raven carried the same desperate warning: the White Walkers are real. The dead walk. We must unite or perish. But as the Lord Commander pointed out, ravens alone might not persuade men locked in a war for the throne. Eddard decided to go south himself. He would gather whatever support he could from the great houses of Westeros, using the cause of the rebellion as well as the threat in the north. The question was, where best to start? He resolved to ride first for Moat Cailin, then to Winterfell to muster more of his bannermen. From there, he would try to meet with Robert Baratheon or his generals, urging them to push on to King's Landing more swiftly or seek some peace to face the true enemy. He knew it would not be simple. The Targaryens still had loyal supporters. But if the realm did not band together, all would be lost under an endless winter. The next morning, Eddard prepared to depart. He left behind a fraction of his men at Castle Black to bolster the watch. Before he went, he stood upon the platform that overlooked the vast northern wilderness. The wind whipped at his cloak. He stared out, remembering the White Walker's silent malice, and thought of his brother. He had not found Benjen. The knowledge gnawed at him. Would he be forced to fight him one day as a White, or was there still hope to save him? Eddard uttered a silent vow that he would return to the Wall with the strength of all Westeros behind him, if only men had the wisdom to put aside their quarrels. He walked down, rejoined his men, and led them south. They rode hard through deep snow and biting wind. Days blurred in a haze of cold and weary travel. When they reached the deserted villages, they found even more had fled, presumably heading south in fear of the rumored undead. Eddard and his escort pressed on, stopping little. They had provisions enough to keep going, though each night was another test of courage against the dread that lurked in every moonlit shadow. At last, they came in sight of the Neck, that narrow land of bogs and swampland that separated the north from the rest of Westeros. The crannogmen might have hidden watchposts in the reeds, but if so, they revealed themselves only to say that travelers were passing south in droves, stirring the quagmires with their frantic flight. They muttered about half-heard rumors of Whites. Word traveled faster than any raven in times of fear. Entering Moat Cailin, Eddard saw a makeshift camp of frightened northerners waiting for safe passage. He explained to them the truth, that if they fled without uniting to fight, the horror would simply follow them. Some listened, others only shook their heads in terror, desperate to escape. Eddard could not blame them. He needed to press on. Upon reaching Winterfell, Eddard found Catelyn waiting anxiously, with a smaller council of northern lords who had remained. The black banner of House Stark fluttered in the courtyard, weighed down by snow. Catelyn embraced him fiercely, relief shining in her eyes. "You returned," she whispered. "It's worse than I feared," he told her. Then he spoke of everything he had seen, the Whites, the White Walkers, the threat to the entire realm. Silence gripped the hall as he told the tale. Though the lords had suspected, hearing the details gave shape to nightmares. Eddard urged them to muster more men, to be ready to march at a moment's notice. The Great Jon, who had accompanied Eddard back south, bellowed that they should ride and burn every White to ash. Roose Bolton's pale eyes glimmered in the torchlight, and for once he voiced no quiet opposition. Perhaps even he recognized that no cunning politics could outwit an ancient evil. Many were ready to heed the call. But before Eddard could finalize these plans, ravens arrived from the warfront in the south. The news was as swift as it was grim. Robert had clashed with Rhaegar on the Trident. The prince was slain, hammered down in the swirling river waters. King Aerys still clung to the throne in King's Landing. Tywin Lannister had marched his forces to the capital, apparently feigning loyalty to the king. Word was that the city had been sacked. The Mad King was dead, betrayed by his own Kingsguard, or so rumor claimed. Robert was preparing to claim the Iron Throne, with few pockets of resistance remaining. The rebellion was nearly won. Eddard stared at the Raven's messages. The war might be all but over. Robert had triumphed. This should have been cause for celebration, for vengeance was served upon the Targaryens. Yet, as Eddard thought of the White Walkers, he felt no joy. If Robert Baratheon now held the throne, Eddard had to go to him to make him see the danger. Perhaps Robert, a friend since boyhood, would believe him. Eddard decided he would ride south to King's Landing at once. He would beg Robert to turn the armies of the realm north, to join the Night's Watch in preparing for the onslaught. For days later, leaving the north in the capable hands of those lords who would soon muster an army under the Stark banner, Eddard departed again, this time leading a smaller escort. He traveled swiftly. The crossing of the Neck was tense. Rumor said scattered Targaryen loyalists still prowled some roads. But the power in the realm had decisively shifted. Rebels were welcomed in many villages and most men had turned cloaks or fled. Passing through the Twins, Eddard encountered Walder Frey's men who demanded courtesy and caution but allowed the Stark lord to continue on unharassed. The crossing of the Green Fork was likewise quiet. Everywhere, word of the Targaryen defeat had traveled and men saluted or cheered for Lord Stark, a hero of the rebellion. Eddard acknowledged them with courtesy but could not hide his grim purpose. He urged them all to remember that a new threat loomed. As they neared the Trident, Eddard saw the remnants of the great battle. The river ran red not long ago, though now the stain was diluted by the constant flow. Fallen banners, broken shields, unburied bodies in small heaps, crows circling overhead. These were the wages of war. And yet those same men, living and dead, might soon stand side by side against the others if the living were wise enough to unite. The thought tore at Eddard, making him wonder how many good men had perished while an ancient evil marched closer. Not far beyond, in the war-torn lands, they found the rebel host. Banners of Baratheon, Stark, Tully, Arryn, and others stood proudly in a sprawling camp that resembled a small city. Tents dotted the muddy fields, men sharpened swords around cook fires, battered siege equipment was stacked in piles. Robert had not yet marched on King's Landing. That task had apparently been done by the Lannisters, though rumors swirled that the Lion of the Rock had turned the city into a charnel house. Many in the camp were anxious for word. Robert himself, they learned, had been gravely wounded in single combat with Prince Rhaegar. But he had survived thanks to his size and fury and was resting in a large command tent. When Eddard approached, the guards recognized him at once and ushered him inside. Robert Baratheon lay on a makeshift cot, his chest bound in linen bandages. Even so, he managed to raise himself at the sight of Eddard and let out a laugh that ended in a cough. He was a big man with thick black hair that curled on his brow. His blue eyes sparkled with relief at seeing his friend. "Ned, about bloody time you showed yourself. I was starting to think the others had taken you." He frowned, perhaps noticing the look in Eddard's eyes. "What is it?" Eddard clenched his jaw. "I've come from the Wall. I've seen White Walkers, Robert. They're real." Robert blinked as if the words took him a moment to process. "The White Walkers? Ned, you must be jesting. We have enough trouble with Targaryen stragglers." And Eddard shook his head. "No jest. I've fought them, Robert. I lost good men. The Night's Watch is overwhelmed. The entire realm is in danger. The winter we always feared is coming, and with it, the army of the dead." In that moment, Robert's usual bluster softened. He saw the truth in Ned's eyes, or at least the unwavering conviction. "Gods be good," he muttered. "White Walkers. But we have half the realm still unsure of who rules. The Lannisters have taken the capital in my name, I suppose, but there is chaos everywhere. And you say we must turn north?" "Yes," Eddard said, stepping closer. "All who live must unite. The Targaryens are finished. If any remain, they can be dealt with later. We must gather the realm's strength, hold the wall, and prepare for a war unlike any we have known." Robert sank back against the pillows, a hand going to the bandage on his side. He winced. "Gods, after all this war, the men are weary. How will I convince them to march again? If you do not, the North will fight alone. But we will not survive long without the realm's help," Eddard said gravely. "You're the victor of this war. If you claim the Iron Throne, you must claim its responsibilities too. The living must stand behind the king." Robert was silent for a time, wrestling with the enormity of what Ned said. The rebellious spark in him that once took up arms against the Targaryens was flickering with uncertainty. At last, he said, "You've never lied to me, Ned, and I'll not doubt your word on this. By the gods, I'll do what I must. The Lannisters await me in King's Landing. I'll go claim that bloody chair, but I'll not sit idle. I'll command every lord in Westeros to send men north. If White Walkers are real, we'll break them as we broke the dragons." Eddard almost smiled with relief. "I can't say how easily they'll break, Robert. They're no mortal foe. but if we stand together, we have a chance. We'll need dragon glass, fire, Valyrian steel. We must equip as many men as we can. And we must do it quickly. Robert nodded, letting out a pained groan as he shifted. We'll see it done. I'll gather my council, Jon Arryn, Hoster Tully, and whomever else remains. The Lannisters, well, we'll see if we can keep them in line. But by the gods, I'd sooner fight side by side with Tywin Lannister than watch an army of corpses devour the realm. Let's just hope the sour old lion sees sense. Eddard recalled Tywin's reputation. The man was cunning and ruthless, a formidable ally or enemy. If it came to pass that the White Walkers advanced, even Tywin might have no choice but to respond. The alternative was oblivion. Once Robert rested, Eddard joined the rest of the rebel camp to spread the word. Skepticism still lingered among certain lords who scoffed at the notion of ancient evils returning. But Eddard's sincerity, along with the hush of dread that was beginning to permeate from the north, swayed many. Jon Arryn approached Eddard with concern etched on his elderly features, saying that if Ned believed it, it must be considered with utmost seriousness. Lord Hoster Tully likewise listened gravely, remarking that he had seen too many horrors in this war to dismiss new ones out of hand. As for the lesser lords, they grumbled at the thought of more fighting, but if King Robert commanded them, many would comply. Word was sent to Edmure Tully, to the Mallisters on the coast, the Blackwoods and the Brackens, the Freys and the Westerlings, each urged to rally men and supplies for a northern campaign. The following week, once Robert was well enough to travel, the rebel host marched south, heading for King's Landing. Eddard rode beside his friend, half expecting to encounter pockets of Targaryen loyalists, but they met only stragglers. The battered realm was on the brink of new leadership. At night, by the campfires, the men spoke in hushed tones about the White Walkers. Some dismissed the stories as drunken fancy, but others, seeing the unwavering seriousness of Lord Stark, began to prepare themselves for an unearthly foe. At last, the towers of King's Landing rose on the horizon. Smoke still drifted from certain quarters of the city. The Lannister forces had reportedly opened the gates in Robert's name. Inside, chaos reigned. The Mad King's body had been burned, his heirs apparently fled or unaccounted for, except for the infant Prince Viserys and the newborn Princess Daenerys, rumored to be somewhere across the Narrow Sea or in Dorne. The city reeked of fear and death. Robert strode through the ruined gates with fury in his eyes, cursing the wanton butchery. But Tywin Lannister received him with a careful bow, presenting the heads of the Targaryen loyalists as tokens of fealty. Robert had little choice but to accept, though Eddard saw the disgust flicker in his friend's expression. It was a hollow victory overshadowed by the threat in the north. Within the Red Keep's throne room, Robert was hailed as King of the Undulls and the First Men, protector of the realm. Eddard stood off to the side, uneasy in this place where his father and brother had been murdered. The Iron Throne loomed, a twisted mass of blades. Robert climbed the steps, wincing at his healing wound, then settled heavily upon the seat. His broad shoulders straightened and he cast a look across the hall. "Lords and ladies," Robert's voice boomed. "We have ended one war, but another stands at our threshold. The White Walkers are real. I name them the true threat to the realm. By my authority, I command every lord in Westeros to send men, steel, and provisions north. We will hold the wall and rid the world of this ancient evil." A murmur rippled through those assembled. Tywin Lannister's green eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. Others exchanged whispers, uncertain. Yet Robert's words held the weight of a king who had won the throne through steel and blood. Slowly, heads bowed in assent. Eddard let out a silent breath of relief. It was far from a guarantee that all corners of the realm would comply. House Greyjoy might bristle at the demand, the Dornish might resent the new king who slew their beloved Prince Rhaegar, and other fractious lords could resist. But at least it was a start. If enough houses answered the call, if they mustered in time, there was hope. Over the next days, the newly crowned King Robert and his advisors worked feverishly to spread word throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Envoys were dispatched to Highgarden, to Sunspear, to Pike, to the Vale. They offered pardons for any Targaryen loyalists who bent the knee on the condition that they unite against the northern threat. Many found this new talk of White Walkers baffling, but the rumors were persistent. The North had seen them, the Night's Watch had proof. As preparations began, Eddard could not escape the knowledge that they might be too slow. Time was not on their side. Every day, the White Walkers could be swelling their numbers of undead or searching for ways past the wall. And Benjen, his fate hung in the balance. Yet for all his urgency, Eddard had done what he could. Now he would push King Robert to move quickly. They would gather armies, assemble smiths to craft dragoglass weapons if any caches could be found, and expedite shipments of food to the north. Some nights, Eddard dreamed again of the white shapes in the dark, the faint blue gleam of those inhuman eyes. He awoke drenched in sweat, hearing the silent question, could they truly save the realm in time, or would the squabbling of mortal lords prove its undoing? One morning, as Eddard made his way along a palace corridor, he encountered Tywin Lannister in quiet discussion with Pycelle, the Grand Maester. They fell silent as Eddard approached. Tywin eyed him coolly. Lord Stark, the Lion of Casterly Rock, said, His Grace insists upon this northern expedition. It will bleed the realm's coffers. Are you so certain the threat is real? Eddard met Tywin's piercing green gaze without flinching. I've seen it with my own eyes, my lord. I have fought them. They are real, and they will kill every last one of us if we don't stand together. Tywin's expression was inscrutable. Then let us hope the gold mines of the West can fuel this war. The crown has little to offer but debts. He inclined his head faintly and walked away, leaving Pycelle to fidget behind him. Eddard felt no warmth for the man who had overseen the sack of King's Landing, but if Tywin recognized the threat and intended to use his vast resources in the fight, it would be a boon. He resolved to keep a close eye on Lannister loyalty, though. They were a proud, calculating house. Any perceived weakness could twist alliances. Still, they had little choice. The White Walkers were an enemy that gold alone could not buy off. The day finally came when Eddard could ride north again. Beside him was Robert, determined to lead the realm personally. They left a regent, Jon Arryn, to oversee King's Landing, while Tywin Lannister went to raise forces in the west and then march for the Neck. Hoster Tully pledged Riverrun swords. The Tyrells of Highgarden sent word that they would muster at least part of their strength once their disputes with the Dornish and the rebellious lords in the Reach were settled. It would take time, but men would come. Or so they promised. As the royal host set forth from the gates of King's Landing, the battered city's populace lined the roads, peering up at the newly anointed king. Many cheered at the sight of Robert in his black armor, Warhammer across his back. Some looked uncertain, though. Why was the king riding north into bitter cold so soon after winning the throne? The rumors of undead gave them little reassurance. Yet Robert led them on, and Eddard Stark rode at his side, the dire wolf and the crowned stag banners drifting in the wind together. The realm, for now, was united in purpose. And perhaps that was the only chance they had. Days turned to weeks on the King's Road. They passed Harrenhal's broken towers, where local lords and refugees whispered of the White Walkers. They crossed the Twins again, though Walder Frey demanded new concessions for the crossing. Robert grudgingly agreed, so great was the urgency. They pressed into the Neck, gathering the outriders Tywin Lannister had dispatched. The combined might of the realm, or at least the first wave of it, was coalescing, heading toward Moat Cailin, then beyond. Snow greeted them as they moved deeper into the north. Eddard rode near Robert, guiding him. Grim messages from Castle Black told of more skirmishes beyond the wall. The White Walkers had grown bolder. The Watchers on the heights had spotted entire columns of whites in the distance, moving south. Still no sign of Benjen. But they had gleaned one piece of hopeful news. Dragonglass arrowheads forged at Dragonstone by some loyalists of House Baratheon or taken from old caches were being shipped north. The properties of obsidian might help if used properly. When at last they drew near Winterfell, the fortress was bustling, filled with men from all corners of the north. Tents sprawled beyond the castle walls, and the combined presence of Bolton, Umber, Manderley, and other lords gave the courtyard a lively, if tense, air. Eddard dismounted, receiving welcomes from his bannermen, from Catelyn, and from his young son Robb, who stared wide-eyed at King Robert. But there was little time for reunions. They had an undead host to face. In council that evening, they stood around a great oak table shaped in the outline of the north, strategizing. They would move to defend the wall with as many men as could be spared. The king's forces would augment the Night's Watch, patrolling every yard of the barrier. They would send rangers beyond the wall to track the White Walkers' movements, and if possible, they would rescue any captives. But the real test would come when the others finally launched their assault. The question was, could they hold that line? Men clamored for different tactics. Some wanted to destroy the gates with wildfire. Others wanted to blockade the far side with a fortified approach. The king asked about luring the others into a trap. Eddard insisted that the best plan was simply to defend at the wall, use dragonglass and steel, and pray that the ancient wards held. Meanwhile, they must coordinate with Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, guard the coasts, remain vigilant against any cunning plan. So it was decided, King Robert, with Eddard as Warden of the North, would lead a vanguard to the wall immediately. More reinforcements were already en route behind them, men from the Riverlands, some from the Westerlands, possibly the Vale, and eventually from the Reach or the Iron Islands if those lords yielded to the king's summons. The final showdown would likely be decided in the far north. Before dawn, the vanguard set forth. Eddard glanced at Winterfell's battlements as they pulled away, hoping that by the old god's grace he would return alive. This time he rode at the head of a great host, each man flying a banner of their own house, but all united under the royal stag and the dire wolf. The columns stretched across the horizon, thousands of horses trudging through the snow, foot soldiers with spears glinting in the pale light. Snow fell steadily, blanketing them in white, but onward they marched. The closer they got to the wall, the harder the wind blew. It was as if the White Walkers themselves had summoned a fierce winter to hamper the armies. Some nights, men froze in their tents, found stiff and pale by sunrise. Still, the army pressed north. Along the way, watchers reported glimpses of wildling stragglers. Some were captured. Their stories were always the same: the dead prowled, commanded by icy demons. They were unstoppable unless you had the magic black stone or special steel that harmed them. By the time King Robert's vanguard reached Castle Black, the stronghold was nearly bursting with black-clad brothers, northern men, and now the influx of southern knights. Robert dismounted, gazing up at the immense wall with awe. By the gods, he breathed, it's bigger than I ever imagined. Then he turned to Eddard. Let's see if it can keep out the nightmares you speak of. They climbed the great switchback stairs to the top of the wall, gazing out over the endless white wilderness. The land beyond lay eerily calm. The watchers pointed to certain black shapes far in the distance. Could be trees, could be drifting snow, or could be the approach of an undead legion. Eddard felt his gut tighten. The final war was near. Days bled into nights as the men fortified their positions. King Robert took personal charge of drilling them, cursing the cold, but relentless in building morale. The men scoured the armories. Maesters distributed what dragonglass, arrowheads, and daggers they had. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging arrowheads from the precious lumps of obsidian that had arrived. Far short of what they needed, but better than nothing. Scouts ventured forth beyond the wall, risking everything. Some returned with tales of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of whites marching in scattered bands. At their center moved a smaller group of White Walkers, commanding them silently. Some said an even more fearsome presence lurked deeper in the wastes, but none could say what. Another rumor came that they had hostages, living men and women. Eddard prayed one was his brother Benjen. Every time the gates opened for a patrol, Eddard felt a pang of dread that he might see his brother's face twisted in death among the whites. The first skirmishes erupted around abandoned wildling camps. Rangers with southern knights at their side scouted the forest, clashed with pockets of undead. Sometimes they returned with minimal losses, having destroyed a handful of whites. Other times they came back battered, half their number missing. White Walkers rarely showed themselves in large numbers, but each sighting yielded terror and casualties. Fire and dragonglass proved as potent as the old tales said. But even so, the others were frighteningly swift and deadly. Each day wore on the men's nerves. Even the boldest hearts quailed at the stories of silent figures with eyes like cold fire, weapons of ice that shattered steel. At Castle Black's courtyard, Eddard found Robert one morning, pacing like a caged bear. "Damn these devils," Robert growled, fists clenched. "We sit here waiting while they pick off our patrols. We should march out in force, wipe them from the face of the earth." Eddard shook his head. "That's what they want. They'll lead us deeper into the frozen wastes, pick us off. The strength of the wall is our best advantage. If they dare to assault us directly, that's where we can stand firm." A horn call interrupted them. A ranger galloped in through the icy gates on a lathered horse, shouting for the Lord Stark. Eddard hurried to meet him. The man, pale-faced with exhaustion, stammered that he had spotted a large movement of whites about a day's ride north, near the Miltwater. And with them rode White Walkers on undead horses. Eddard closed his eyes briefly. The first wave, or so it seemed. It was upon them sooner than expected. By the time the men had readied themselves at the top of the wall, black shapes in the distance coalesced into a seething mass. The undead advanced across the white plain, a slow, ceaseless surge of bodies. Here and there, the pale outlines of the White Walkers glinted in the moonlight. King Robert stood at Eddard's side, both men silent as they watched an army that could rival anything mortal wars had mustered. The watchers muttered prayers. Even from a distance, the sight was enough to chill a brave man's soul. So the great bells rang out, summoning every soldier to the battlements. Torches and braziers were lit along the wall. Archers took up positions behind parapets of ice. Siege engines, hastily adapted to launch canisters of burning pitch or wildfire, were rolled into place. The watchers prepared barrels of dragonglass arrowheads. The wind howled, blowing across the plain. Snow whipped around the marching silhouettes of the dead. The clatter of bone and armor drifted upward, an eerie cacophony. Eddard glanced at Robert, who gripped his warhammer, knuckles white. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" Ned asked quietly. Robert exhaled, a puff of mist. "I've never been ready for something like this, Ned. But I will not yield." Below, the White Walkers halted their army just out of arrow range. Their eyes gleamed blue in the darkness, as if appraising the wall's defenses. A hush fell across the battlements. Then one White Walker, mounted on a skeletal horse, raised a longsword of frosted crystal. An unearthly shriek echoed over the wind. The Legion of the Dead let out a moaning wail. They began to move. Eddard Stark tightened his hold on ice, feeling the ancient sword's cold steel under his grip. He could almost hear the hammering of his own heart. The fate of the realm might be decided in the next few hours or days or weeks if the living could endure the winter storms and the endless ranks of death. He thought of Catelyn, of Robb, of Sansa, and Arya, the latter still in infancy, safe in Winterfell. He prayed. He thought of Benjen, possibly out there among the White Walkers' captives. He prayed for the old gods to give them strength. A horn blast boomed, and from the heights of the wall, the first volley of dragonglass-tipped arrows streaked downward, a black rain that flared with torchlight. Men shouted, the sounds mingling with the shrieks of the undead. And so the true war began. In that instant, Eddard felt his courage harden. The living would fight as one or perish. The ancient foe from legend was at their gates, and all the pride, feuds, and petty squabbles among men meant nothing in the face of this icy darkness. He raised his sword, gave the command to fire. King Robert roared a challenge, bellowing curses and battle cries into the frigid night. The White Walkers advanced, calm, patient, cunning. Far above, the black sky stretched to infinity. It seemed impossible, but Eddard Stark knew in his heart that they must prevail. For the sake of every innocent life behind them, for every child who deserved a chance to grow and see the sun rise on a peaceful realm, they would fight. The wall stood as a last bastion. Whether it would endure or shatter, none could say, but the men and women upon it would not falter while breath remained in their bodies. In the swirl of snow and flame, steel and ice, the story of Westeros bent toward a future no one had anticipated. Yet Eddard Stark, sworn to duty and honor, faced it unflinching, for that was his way. The White Walkers had marched during Robert's rebellion, but now, at this decisive hour, the realm stood scarred, divided, yet united enough to confront the oncoming tide of death. Beyond the wall, a second darkness gathered, full of sinister purpose. The final outcome would be written in blood and fire, in shattered swords and singed flesh. But the living still held hope, for as long as men like Eddard Stark remained faithful to their oaths, the dawn had not yet been lost. The cold wind that scoured the top of the wall carried a distant chorus of moans as the dead advanced across the pale expanse below. Torches hissed and sputtered where they lined the defensive parapets, lending scant warmth against a cold deeper than any normal winter storm. Eddard Stark stood beside King Robert Baratheon, both men silent for a moment, watching as countless silhouettes, some little more than black specks against the whiteness, moved in slow unison far beneath the icy heights. Despite the numbness in his gloved fingers, Eddard felt a hot surge of anxiety in his veins. He had come all this way, dragging half the realm behind him, to stand upon a bitter vantage that might decide the fate of every living soul in Westeros. Now the hour had arrived. He heard the hiss of breath that escaped Robert's lips. The new king's face, still bearing signs of the wounds from the trident, was tense. In the flickering torchlight, he looked older than his years, his bearded cheeks hollowed by the cold. Yet the warhammer he gripped, the same that had crushed Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, rested on the rampart like a defiant statement. Ironically, that weapon might do little against an other unless it was tipped or inlaid with some form of dragonglass or Valyrian steel. And Eddard felt that pang of concern. How many of these men had come this far, only to realize that their stout steel would do little more than slow the White Walkers? Beside them, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, an older man with a face lined by years of hardship, released a measured breath. We've posted archers along every yard of the battlements. Our ballistae and catapults are fitted to launch casks of oil and wildfire, though we have precious little of either. The watch stands ready, my lords. But if they come in numbers too great, his voice trailed off, leaving the grim reality unspoken. No army in recent memory had faced an other host of this magnitude. This was not a war of men squabbling over a throne. This was a battle for survival itself. Eddard ran a hand over the frosty hilt of ice, his ancestral sword, thankful it was Valyrian steel. The dark metal gleamed with a subtle sheen even in the weak torchlight. The faint warmth of the living pulsed along its edge whenever he touched it, as if the sword could sense this new threat. He turned to the archers. "Loose the first volley," he called, his breath drifting in thin wisps. "Dragonglass arrows only. Let us see how they respond. The archers, perched in tight clusters behind the ice crenellations, obeyed. There followed the creak of bowstrings. Eddard saw the flicker of torchlight glint upon arrowheads chipped from obsidian. Then came the snapping twang of release. A dark flurry cut through the air, plummeting toward the massed whites below. At this range, most arrows would vanish into the swirl of snow, though a faint hiss followed as they struck their targets. Moments later, small bursts of blackish smoke or pale dust indicated hits on undead flesh. Some whites collapsed, pinned under the dragonglass. Others went rigid for an instant before disintegrating in unnatural spasms. From high above, it was impossible to see the full effect, but Eddard thought the lines of the dead shuddered ever so slightly. Robert raised an arm. Again, he roared, the wind devouring part of his voice, but the archers heard. Another volley went up, shafts winging through the night. Eddard heard muttered prayers from the men around him. The temperature seemed to plummet further as a rustle of movement drew his gaze along the ramparts. Ser Jeremy Ricker, a knight from the Vale who had joined this expedition, walked hurriedly toward them, his cheeks raw from the cold. "My lords," Ser Jeremy said in a taut whisper, "scouts from the West Tower signal movement beyond the treeline. More whites. No telling how many. The entire forest may be crawling with them." Eddard suppressed a grimace. "Then we hold here," he said, forcing calm into his tone. "That was always the plan. The wall is our best defense." He glanced across the walkway, checking the men assigned to watch for any cunning trick from the others. These were not mindless beasts alone. The White Walkers had a sinister, intelligent cunning that dwarfed the lumbering aggression of mere whites. They could exploit weaknesses, slip through cracks. Eddard had seen how swiftly one of them could move, how lethally they used their ice weapons. Worse still, they might sense fear, capitalizing on it to send men into disarray. He turned back to Robert. "They'll test our defenses, then wait. If we stay vigilant, we'll keep them at a distance. But for how long? The realm's main host won't arrive for weeks yet. Tywin Lannister, Hoster Tully, the men from the Reach and the Vale, only a fraction are here. The rest are still on the roads, slowed by winter storms." Robert let out a low growl. "We can't send them all back. We can't meet them in the field. By all the gods, if they storm the wall with that undead army," he stopped as if unwilling to give shape to that possibility. Then his eyes hardened. "We'll greet them with steel and fire and show these creatures that men are not as easily crushed as they might think." The wind gusted again, whipping snow across the ramparts, forcing men to shield their eyes. Eddard glimpsed the faint glow of dawn at the horizon, a thin line of paleness creeping behind the clouds. Another day about to begin, with the others gathered in force. He tried to recall how many times he had yearned for the end of Robert's rebellion, the end of bloodshed, never imagining that a darker war would follow so swiftly. Now there could be no respite. In the courtyard below, men bustled about like ants preparing for a flood. Great braziers blazed, manned by stewards who fed them with wood and peat. Barrels of pitch stood by the inner gate, ready to be hoisted up to the battlements. Knights and foot soldiers warmed their hands, trying to ignore the horror outside. No one truly knew what the day would bring, only that it would test the spirit of every living soul present. Eddard left Robert at the ramparts to confer with the Lord Commander. They descended the creaking wooden steps into the courtyard, the swirl of activity enveloping them. The men parted respectfully, some calling, "Lord Stark," others saluting the king with fists to their chests. Robert waved off the formalities. The tension in his face showed he was in no mood for ceremony. They crossed to a small antechamber near the common hall, a space that had been turned into a war room of sorts. Maps were pinned to wooden walls. Makeshift braziers hissed with coals, trying valiantly to chase away the penetrating chill. Inside waited the Lord Commander, a handful of senior officers from the Watch, and several of the northern lords who had come. The Great John towered over everyone, arms folded, face grim. Roose Bolton stood off to one side, watching with unsettling composure. Lord Wyman Manderley was absent, having fallen ill from the brutal cold on the march north, though many of his knights remained to represent White Harbor. Newly arrived from King's Landing were a few southern lords who had ridden with Robert as his personal guard, among them older knights like Grandison and Catherine, uncertain how to face a threat out of legends. Eddard saw the tension etched on their faces. Only a few days earlier, they had been heartened to learn that initial skirmishes against small pockets of the undead could be won with the correct weapons. But now, seeing the full host gather at the fringes, many had lost the last illusions of easy victory. The White Walkers had brought an entire legion, enough to challenge the might of the living at the greatest barrier in the realm. The Lord Commander gestured for them to gather around a rough map of the wall and the surrounding terrain. On the map, chalk lines indicated the suspected distribution of whites, with question marks near the key passes. The watchers at Eastwatch by the Sea have reported movement along the coast. We suspect part of this horde is heading in that direction, or at least testing the coastline for weaknesses. A smaller force might be circling toward the Shadow Tower on the western end of the wall. We'd be vulnerable if they find a way to scale the cliffs or slip through hidden tunnels. Robert set down his warhammer, leaning it against a bench. And Castle Black is right in the center, he said, as though stating an unpleasant fact. So these creatures might be planning to attack at multiple points at once, stretching our defenses. How many men do we have in total? One of the senior officers, his black cloak trimmed with frost, spoke quietly. Counting all who came north with you, plus the watch's own number, we stand at around 7,000. But nearly half are not fully equipped with obsidian weapons. We've enough arrowheads to supply maybe a quarter of the archers and shifts. Most foot soldiers rely on steel. The Great John pounded a fist on the table, causing the map to flutter. Steel may not kill them cleanly, but will hack them apart just the same. The whites can still be slowed by removing their heads. As for the White Walkers, he grimaced. Well, you saw how many can go down if they face a Valyrian blade or Dragoglass. We do have some wildfire to hurl at them, do we not? A small store, the Lord Commander said, nodding. Not enough for a prolonged siege. The pyromancers in King's Landing promised more shipments, but who knows how soon that will arrive. And in this cold, it's risky to handle. Robert rubbed a hand over the bandaged scar on his side. We'll have to make do. He turned to Eddard. We can't wait for the rest of the realm's armies to gather. They'll take too long. We must hold with what we have, or at least stave the others off until reinforcements arrive. Eddard glanced at the map, thinking of the tales from the Long Night, thousands of years ago when the first men and the children of the forest united to drive the White Walkers back. They had the advantage of Dragoglass in that age, and perhaps some lost magic. Now, the men of Westeros had only scraps of that old knowledge. We should consider daily scouting parties beyond the wall, he said. Small, swift groups armed with obsidian and led by experienced rangers. They can disrupt the whites, pick off White Walkers who travel apart from the main host, and gather intelligence. If the others press in too close or find a new path, we need to know before they catch us unawares. Bolton's pale eyes flickered with a cold glimmer. A valid strategy, he murmured. Though a risky one. Those men might be lost to the cold or to an ambush. They know the risks, Eddard replied. If we sit behind the wall and let the enemy move at will, we'll be blind. I won't sacrifice good men lightly, but we need to see their movements. Robert grunted. Then do it. I'll send some of my own knights as well. He paused, glancing at Eddard's face. You fought them before, Ned. You know what we're dealing with. If you think it's wise, I'll not gainsay it. But I want at least half those scouting groups to return alive. Otherwise, we learn nothing. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of coals. At last, the Lord Commander spoke up. We should also station more men at the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch. If the White Walkers attempt to pincer maneuver, Castle Black alone can't hold the entire wall. Robert inhaled slowly. Agreed. I'll dispatch some men to both fortresses, though we can ill afford to split ourselves too thin. Then he gestured at the map's southern side. As for the realm behind us, do we send messages urging the small folk to flee south? Or do we keep them in place, rely on them for provisions? Eddard glanced at the Lord Commander, who looked grim. Wintertown and the other northern villages near the wall have largely emptied, Eddard said. They're either seeking refuge in Winterfell or traveling further south. We cannot protect them here. The less of them remain, the fewer will fall prey to the whites. Aye, and fewer mouths to feed, Robert agreed, though his face showed no pleasure. Sending innocents south as refugees was a sad necessity. He shifted his weight and lifted his hammer again. We have our plan then. More men to the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch. Regular scouting sorties. Keep that damned watch day and night. The moment they move, I want to know. He glanced around the circle of gathered men, meeting each gaze in turn. Any other suggestions? For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Eddard said in a quiet voice, We should consider the possibility that the White Walkers mean to cross the wall by means other than brute force. They have dark magic. They might find old tunnels or hidden ways. In the stories of the Long Night, it said they rode on monstrous undead creatures, even giant ice spiders. Perhaps they can scale the cliffs in places we think impassable. A chill silence answered him. Roose Bolton's lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. Your tales grow more dire by the hour, Lord Stark, but I cannot say you're wrong. We will maintain extra vigilance on all flanks. The Lord Commander's face was stone. We cannot discount any tactic. The wall has held for 8,000 years, but it has never been tested by a force like this in living memory. We must assume they have cunning to match their malice." With that, the council ended. The men dispersed, each weighed down by the knowledge of what lay outside. Eddard excused himself to return to the ramparts. He wanted to see with his own eyes what the night or day might bring. When he emerged once more upon the top of the wall, the faint light of morning was just creeping over the eastern sky, painting the vast snowfields in an eerie gray blue. He stared out at the silent horde, which seemed to have settled in a ring just beyond arrow range. Many wights were standing motionless, as if waiting for some silent command. In the distance, though, he saw a handful of shapes riding, or perhaps circling, white walkers on their dead horses. A sense of unreality washed over him, as if he stood in a dream. Only the ache of the cold in his bones reminded him that this was all too real. The others were not mere storybook terrors. They had come, in the flesh, to drag the realm into a frozen oblivion. He had no illusions that a single desperate battle would break them. This would be a campaign, a siege, a war of attrition with an enemy who never tired, never starved, never felt fear. The men around him would have to show courage beyond anything they had known. For all Robert's famed prowess, for all the savage determination of the Northern Lords, it might still be too little. He gazed at the silent lines below, remembering his brother Benjen. The scout's last words had said that Benjen had been taken by the others. If that was true, how might they be using him? The thought of Benjen turned into a wight, or held captive for some vile purpose, filled Eddard with despair he fought to suppress. He would do all in his power to free his brother or lay him to rest if rescue was impossible. Perhaps these daily scouting sorties might yield a clue. At midday, the first wave of rangers departed from Castle Black, riding out through the icy tunnel under the wall. Eddard supervised the preparations. He saw them off with a solemn nod, each man armed with dragonglass blades or arrowheads, plus torches and tinder. Leading the party was Ser Waymar Royce, once a cocky noble youth from the Vale, now tempered by the shock of encountering whites in earlier skirmishes, and alongside him a handful of seasoned black brothers who knew every inch of the haunted forest. The gates closed behind them, leaving the watchers to wonder if they would return by dusk. Hours crept by, the tension unrelenting. Occasionally, Eddard glimpsed faint movement among the distant ranks of the dead. He thought perhaps the whites shuffled, or maybe some were rotting so badly that limbs fell away. Yet there was no grand assault, only a waiting hush, as though the others toyed with mortal nerves. A few men tried to get some rest, snatching sleep in the cramped barracks or near the fires. Eddard busied himself in going through the stores, ensuring all possible measures were in place. King Robert, though restless, forced himself to remain near the top of the wall, scanning the horizon. From time to time, Eddard climbed to stand beside him, exchanging few words but sharing the heavy watch. Late in the afternoon, a horn blast sounded from the outer gate. Everyone on the battlements tensed, scanning for signs of an attack. Then a shout echoed up, "They're back! Open the gates!" Eddard exhaled shakily. At least some part of the scouting party had survived. He hurried down to the courtyard. Ser Waymar was among those who rode in, though he had lost 3 men. His face was streaked with soot, and he carried a bloody dragonglass dagger at his side. His horse's flanks were foamed with sweat despite the cold. As he dismounted, Eddard strode forward to meet him, Robert at his shoulder. Men crowded around, anxious to hear news. "We scouted the old wildling trails near the Milkwater," Ser Waymar said, his voice trembling from either cold or shock. "The undead roam in large patrols, some with white walkers leading them. We avoided one group, managed to ambush a smaller cluster of whites. We destroyed them, but," he swallowed hard, eyes wide. "One of my men got too close to a white walker. The creature ran him through with a blade of ice. Froze him from the inside as if his blood turned to shards. Then it vanished into the woods. We found no sign of living prisoners. And no sign of Benjen Stark." Eddard's heart sank, though he had not truly expected a miracle so soon. He rested a hand on Ser Waymar's shoulder. "You did well to return and bring us this news. Go warm yourself, see the maesters for your injuries." Robert turned to the men in the courtyard, raising his voice. "You hear that? The others are patrolling in small groups, picking off stragglers. They want us to come out and fight on their terms. But we'll hold here, make no mistake. Let them break themselves against the wall if they dare." A few men cheered, though their voices wavered with a brittle edge. They wanted to believe in victory, needed to believe. Eddard merely nodded, offering what encouragement he could. In truth, the slow, strangling nature of this siege might be worse than open battle. Every day tested morale. Every day risked losing men to cold, fear, or the cunning of the enemy. But if they rushed forth, they would face an endless supply of wights, all in the other's domain. No, the wall was their lifeline as it had been in ages past. That night, Eddard slept fitfully on a cot in a private chamber deeper within Castle Black. He dreamed again of chilling shapes in the gloom, eyes like blue stars. He saw them reaching for Winterfell, for his children, for all the living he loved. He dreamt that the gates of the wall had collapsed under some terrible power and a tide of undead spilled through while a bitter, laughter-like wind howled overhead. He snapped awake in the dark, panting, sweat frozen on his brow. Taking a moment to steady himself, he rose, threw on his cloak, and went to walk the corridors, determined to calm his mind through vigilance. A few men bowed or saluted him as he passed with a torch in hand, but the darkness weighed heavily and none spoke beyond the simplest greetings. The entire fortress felt poised on the edge of doom. Dawn brought a new horror. From atop the wall, watchers saw the undead host had moved closer in the night, creeping within arrow range now. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of wights stood rank on rank across the field of snow. In scattered formations, White Walkers sat astride their skeletal horses, motionless. It was as if they wanted to show the living their vast numbers a silent intimidation. The men upon the ramparts stirred restlessly. Orders were barked, archers readied. Eddard reached the top of the steps to find King Robert already there, leaning on a section of ice crenellation, his face grim. Robert gestured out toward the sprawling lines. "It looks like they mean to test us today. Gods, what an awful sight." Before Eddard could reply, a strange noise drifted up from below, a high-pitched shriek like ice scraping against stone. Several watchers flinched. The horses in the courtyard whinnied in alarm. Eddard felt the hair on his arms stand on end as the shriek repeated, echoing across the plain. It had a mocking quality, as though some malicious intelligence toyed with them. Then one of the White Walkers raised an arm. The wights began to shuffle forward. A captain of the archers glanced at Eddard, awaiting orders. Eddard nodded. "Loose," he said, forcing calm into his voice. The command was relayed up and down the battlements. Hundreds of bowstrings sang at once, sending a black torrent of dragonglass-tipped arrows into the icy air. The shafts descended in a whirring storm. Down below, the first lines of wights stumbled, many struck cleanly. Some crumpled on impact, their dead flesh riddled with glass. Others buckled as the obsidian's magic took hold, limbs contorting or simply crumbling to dust. For a moment, Eddard felt a surge of hope. This was an impressive volley indeed. But more wights pressed in behind, climbing over their fallen, heedless of losses. Archers drew and loosed again. The effect was the same. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of wights fell, but still more advanced. A few White Walkers in the second rank gestured with their hands, and the dead rose anew. Some wights that had been struck down by lesser hits clawed their way back upright, dragging arrow-pierced torsos behind them. Men on the wall cursed or muttered prayers to the Seven or the old gods alike. The scale of the assault threatened to overwhelm any sense of advantage. "Archers to the ready, second wave," one of the lieutenants yelled. "Take aim. Fire." Volley after volley darkened the morning sky, each flight reducing more wights to ruined corpses. But the undead kept coming, step by shuffling step. As they drew within range of the scorpions and catapults, the Night's Watch signaled to load casks of wildfire. Eddard observed from near the center, heart-pounding. This was not a typical siege. A normal army would have broken under such sustained missile fire. But these creatures felt no pain, no fear. Only total annihilation would halt them. A heavy crash resounded as the first catapult hurled a barrel of wildfire. It soared in a lazy arc, then came smashing down amidst a dense cluster of wights. A split second later, a brilliant green explosion burst forth, emerald flames erupting across the snow. The men cheered at the sight. Undead flesh blackened and melted in the conflagration. For a moment, the portion of the line impacted by wildfire reeled, lurching away from the searing heat. Another cask followed, and another, each blooming into a toxic plume of green. The air stank of chemical fire, and the wind carried the reek up the wall, stinging men's eyes. Yet even wildfire had its limits. The wave of wights parted around the burning patches, some stumbling into the flames and collapsing, others trudging on, unaffected by the agony that would have made living men flee in terror. Here and there, the watchers could see White Walkers weaving among the ranks, seemingly urging the dead forward, stepping lightly over charred remains. Eddard tightened his hands on the parapet, struggling against the urge to call for a retreat that made no sense. There was nowhere to retreat. From off to his right, he heard Robert bellow, "Bastards! Fire again! We'll burn them all to cinders." The king's voice was raw. He might have been a fearsome presence on a battlefield of living foes, but this unnatural enemy taxed even his formidable spirit. A messenger rushed up the steps. "Lord Stark! The gates! They're attacking the main gate." Eddard's eyes snapped down to the base of the wall. Sure enough, knots of wights had reached the outer defenses near the tunnel that led under the ice, where a heavy portcullis and multiple iron-reinforced doors sealed the entrance. Already, men with spears were jabbing down from murder holes, trying to keep the creatures at bay. A few wights battered at the gates with rusted weapons, skeletal hands, or bits of shattered timber. If they kept at it and more arrived, they might eventually force an entry. The largest threat, though, was the possibility of a White Walker with some cold magic. "Send the reserve swordsman to the inner gatehouse," Eddard commanded. "Prepare the oil and pitch. Let no wight break through." The messenger saluted and bolted off. Eddard forced himself to remain calm. The battle was joined in earnest now, and it would be fought in multiple places along the wall. In the distance, horns began to sound from the west, and he realized the Shadow Tower must be facing an assault as well. The entire northern frontier was under siege. The question was whether the others had the numbers to coordinate multiple breakthroughs. More wildfire casks roared out from the siege engines, and a dozen or more wights vanished in green flame. Another volley of arrows from the ramparts flickered down. For a brief span, Eddard thought they might be holding them off. Then he heard a terrible crackling, creaking sound. He whirled to see, at the far left corner of the castle's outer defenses, a swirling mist gathering. It was tinted an unnatural white blue, and it swelled like a living thing. Men stationed there shouted in alarm. Within the mist, the silhouette of a White Walker stood with one arm raised as though conjuring some foul sorcery. A sudden crack rang out. The thick ice that composed the rampart in that area groaned under an invisible strain. Chunks of it shattered loose. One watchman lost his footing and plummeted screaming off the wall. The entire parapet quaked as if in an earthquake, the ancient structure protesting the assault of magic it was never meant to face alone. Eddard stared aghast. He had not believed the others could do such damage to the wall itself, but perhaps with enough time or enough power, they might. That thought chilled him more than the frosty air. Fortunately, the White Walker's magic seemed localized. The man who fell vanished in the swirling gloom, gone in an instant. But the rest of the rampart held, if barely. Archers near that area scrambled back, loosing arrows at the White Walker below. A few obsidian shafts struck near the creature, one even slicing into its shoulder. With a shriek like shattering glass, the White Walker withdrew, fading into the swirling ranks of wights. The crack in the rampart sealed with shifting ice and drifting snow, though the structural damage remained. Eddard let out a breath, grateful the entire section had not collapsed. He returned his focus to the front lines, scanning for any sign of an opening. The wights were piling up along the base of the wall now, forming grotesque mounds of frozen corpses. Some were still twitching, reanimated by the White Walker's unholy power. Above them, men hurled torches, pots of burning pitch, anything that might slow the climbing dead. The stench of charred flesh choked the air. The shrieks of dying soldiers and the moans of the undead blended into a cacophony that battered the senses. Eddard never imagined a battle so relentlessly grim, so lacking in the usual rhythms of cavalry charges and infantry lines. This was a tide of horror, lapping relentlessly at the wall. Time lost meaning in the swirl of chaos. Hour after hour, the men of Castle Black held. Archers shot until their arms ached. Reserves rushed to the gatehouse, repelling attempts by the wights to break through. The courtyard behind the walls filled with wounded, some afflicted by frozen gashes where an other's weapon had grazed them. King Robert descended more than once to rally the men in the courtyard, roaring encouragement, clapping men on the shoulder. Though no single moment felt decisive, the defenders managed to contain the undead, preventing a breach. The sun rose higher, though it remained pale behind cloud cover. By midday, the ground before the wall was carpeted with the corpses of wights. Hundreds, thousands even, had been reduced to mangled pieces or burned ash. And yet the White Walkers had an even greater horde beyond sight, an endless supply of the dead. When the sun hung low in the sky, the assault slackened as abruptly as it had begun. The wights fell back, retreating to a distance beyond arrow range. Men watched from the ramparts, exhausted and hollow-eyed. Despite the heartbreak of fallen comrades, a ragged cheer rippled along the top of the wall. They had withstood the first major onslaught. The White Walkers had tested them and found a fortress not so easily taken. At least for today. Eddard wanted to feel relief, but all he felt was a smoldering dread. The others had not thrown everything into that attack. They had tested defenses and inflicted casualties, but not risked a full-scale push. They learned how the men fought, how wildfire was used, how obsidian arrows rained from the battlements. Next time, they would adapt, try something new. And the living had lost a portion of their dwindling stock of wildfire, used countless obsidian arrowheads, and watched some of the wall's structure crack. If the White Walkers repeated that sorcerous assault in multiple places, the results could be catastrophic. He spent the remainder of the day moving among the wounded, offering what comfort he could. The maester's chambers were overwhelmed. Men groaned on straw pallets, arms and legs blackened by frostbite or by the lethal touch of the others. Some died in thrashing agony. Robert joined Eddard for a time, looking somber in a way Eddard had never seen before. "This is worse than any battlefield," Robert muttered. "At least in normal war, men die quickly by steel. These men just freeze from the inside out. It's monstrous." Eddard nodded, pressing a cloth to a dying man's forehead. "Aye, monstrous is the right word. All we can do is carry on." He paused, scanning the rows of wounded. His eyes fixed on a younger soldier, barely more than a boy, whose hand had been sheathed in ice. A Night's Watch maester tried to chip away the frozen shards, but the lad screamed, tears mingling with snot and blood. Eddard turned away, swallowing the bile in his throat. The others had brought an evil beyond reason. Night fell once more. The defenders took turns on watch, some collapsing into brief sleep, others standing guard with torches or bows. Eddard dozed for a scant hour, haunted by the image of that swirling frost cracking the wall. Eventually, he rose and paced the battlements again. Under the moon's faint glow, the undead host was still visible in the distance, a somber mass. Occasionally, faint shrieks or rumbles drifted across, but no fresh assault came. Perhaps they were content to let the living stew in dread. Eddard wondered how many nights might pass before the final storm. At dawn, new horns sounded from Eastwatch by the sea, and ravens arrived bearing dire messages. The undead had struck there as well. The garrison held for now, but they were battered, short of supplies, and needed reinforcements. Eddard, Robert, and the Lord Commander gathered swiftly to decide. They could ill afford to dispatch many men, lest Castle Black be compromised. Yet if Eastwatch fell, the enemy could flank them along the coast. Robert swore vehemently, demanding to know where their promised reinforcements were. A new messenger arrived from the south, explaining that reinforcements under Tywin Lannister and Hoster Tully were moving up the King's Road, but had been delayed by harsh storms near the neck. Some suspected sabotage by bandits or rebellious pockets of Targaryen loyalists, though it was uncertain. Even so, Robert insisted that some portion of his knights must ride to Eastwatch, and Eddard agreed. They assembled a column of around 500 men, part heavy cavalry, part foot, and sent them eastward, led by Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, who had come north as part of the vanguard. The Blackfish was a seasoned commander, cunning and unafraid of risk. It was the best they could do under dire circumstances. The men departed, their horses trotting out through the same tunnel under the wall, faces set with grim resolve. Eddard watched them vanish into the swirling snow, uncertain if he would ever see them again. That day and the next, the undead host maintained a watchful distance. Eddard took advantage of the lull to send more rangers into the forest, hoping to glean any sign of new enemy movements. Some returned with small victories, killing stray whites or unmounted White Walkers, but the overall picture remained bleak. The White Walkers had spread out in large arcs, controlling most of the land immediately beyond the wall. The men in black glimpsed evidence of new horrors: half-eaten animal carcasses reanimated, the remains of wildling camps used as bait. Morale wavered each time such news reached Castle Black, and still no sign of Benjen Stark. On the third day, a fresh calamity struck. The White Walkers unleashed another assault, this time focusing on the western flank near Oakenshield Tower, a lesser fortification that had been minimally garrisoned. Horn blasts alerted the main castle. Men rushed onto the ramparts to see a wedge of whites advancing in tight formation, an ominous spectacle of discipline not typical of mindless corpses. They battered at Oakenshield's palisade. Then came another swirl of that frosty mist, and part of the wooden structure froze solid and snapped like brittle glass. Some watchers from Castle Black launched volley after volley, but the distance was too great. The men at Oakenshield were on their own. Eddard, seeing the crisis, hurried to King Robert, who was striding across the courtyard with a retinue of knights. "Your Grace, we must dispatch a relief force to Oakenshield at once. If they break that tower, they'll have a foothold on this side of the wall." Robert nodded grimly. "I'll lead them myself. I won't sit idle while the others carve holes in our defenses." Eddard hesitated. "We can't risk you being taken, Robert. If you fall—" Robert cut him off with a fierce scowl. "I am the king, Ned, not some cowering figurehead. If the men see me fight, they'll rally. This is what I was born to do." Eddard recognized that stubborn glint in Robert's eye. No argument would dissuade him. "Very well. I'll come too." Within minutes, a force of about 600 men on foot, plus 300 mounted, had assembled in the courtyard, bristling with spears, crossbows, and as many obsidian blades as they could muster. Robert gave the order, and they poured out of Castle Black's gate, emerging onto the snowy plain that stretched westward. The cold was savage, the wind snapping at cloaks. Men huddled in close formations for warmth, breath fogging in unison. Eddard rode near Robert, who was astride a powerful warhorse, his warhammer strapped across his back. They advanced in a cautious formation, eyes peeled for hidden wights. The going was slow. Dead shrubs and partially frozen streams made the terrain treacherous. Now and again, they heard faint cries of battle from ahead. The tower must already be under siege. Driven by urgency, they picked up the pace. At last, the dark shape of Oakenshield Tower loomed before them, little more than a squat outpost rising from the snow. Eddard saw figures defending a half-collapsed palisade. Beyond that palisade seethed a mass of wights, gnashing and clawing. "Form lines," Robert roared, drawing his hammer. "Archers, prepare to loose." He glanced at Eddard, eyes blazing with fierce energy. "We'll clear them out from behind, pinch them between our lines and the tower garrison." Eddard nodded, raising ice in signal. "Archers, take aim." Dozens of bowstrings drew taut, dragging obsidian-tipped shafts into place. The front rank of wights turned, sensing new prey. Then Eddard gave the order, and the archers fired. A volley streaked forward, punching into the rear flank of the undead. Several of the wights collapsed or burst apart upon impact, the dark magic fueling them snuffed by the dragonglass. Others wheeled around, jaws slack, eyes burning with that eerie glow. They came stumbling toward Robert's host in a grotesque wave. "Spearmen, hold formation," one of the captains bellowed. The front lines braced their long spears. The wights crashed into them, bodies impaled, rotted limbs flailing. Some men coughed at the stench of decay. Others gagged as blackened blood spattered over the snow. The second wave of archers fired over the spearmen's heads, picking off more wights. Eddard guided his horse through the lines, wielding ice to strike down any undead that got too close. A wight lurched forward, half its face missing, a battered helmet perched atop a skull. With a fierce arc of Valyrian steel, Eddard cleaved it in two, the body collapsing into quivering fragments that quickly stilled. On the far side, Robert spurred his warhorse, Ham, mare in hand. He swung mightily, caving in the skull of a wight that reached for his mount's flank. Another blow scattered bone shards like splinters. The king's retinue pressed in behind him, swords flashing. A few brandished torches lighting up the swirl of snow and foul stench. Eddard saw one knight strike a wight's torso clean off, only for the creature's arms to keep clawing at the horse's legs. The knight had to chop again, cursing, to sever the limbs. The defenders at Oakenshield, seeing help arrive, rallied with a ragged shout. They poured arrows and spears into the wights pinned between tower and relief force. Within moments, the undead found themselves caught in a savage crossfire. Slowly, the living gained ground. Eddard felt a flicker of hope this might be a swift victory, at least in local terms. But the White Walkers themselves were nowhere in sight. Where were they? His question was answered with a sudden hiss behind him. He twisted in the saddle, glimpsing a figure of pale flesh and rime. A white walker stood barely 20 paces away, having emerged from behind a ruined section of the palisade, possibly waiting for the perfect moment. Its eyes glowed a deep, malevolent blue, and its tall form radiated cold that seemed to freeze the air in shimmering motes. In its hand it held a spear of crystalline ice. Instantly, Eddard's breath felt thick in his throat. He wheeled his horse around, raising ice in both hands. The walker turned its head, a slow, predatory movement. Then it shot forward with inhuman speed as if gliding across the snow. Eddard spurred his horse aside, narrowly evading a spear thrust that crackled with frost. The horse screamed, steam rising from its flank where the cold aura brushed against its hide. Eddard slashed, but the walker flowed out of the blade's path. Only the tip of ice grazed its ribs, drawing a sliver of pale vapor. The walker hissed, its voice like wind over shards of broken glass. It pivoted, spear lancing at Eddard again. Eddard managed to catch the spear on Ice's blade, deflecting it. Sparks of frost danced in the air around the contact point. He felt the shock of chill through his arms, threatening to numb his fingers. This was a duel of reflexes and nerve. One mistake and he would be skewered by that icy weapon, or the walker would slip behind him to deliver a killing strike. As the creature drew back for another blow, Eddard forced his horse forward, ramming the beast's shoulder into the walker. The undead being hissed, stepping aside in a sinuous motion that defied normal human movement. Eddard followed through with a downward slash, which nicked its leg. A misty swirl marked the wound. The walker hissed louder, as though outraged by the second cut. It retaliated with a wide sweep of its spear. Eddard ducked, feeling a rush of frigid air that left a layer of frost on his cloak. Another half-inch higher and it would have taken his head off. Summoning all his strength, Eddard urged the horse sideways, intending to flank the walker, but the creature leapt with impossible grace, landing behind Eddard's mount. The horse bucked, terror in its eyes. Eddard had to struggle to maintain balance. In that instant, the white walker thrust its spear again, aiming for Eddard's back. By some instinct, Eddard flung himself from the saddle, tumbling onto the snow. He rolled, trying not to lose his grip on ice. The spear scraped the edge of his cloak, a needle of cold piercing the fabric. Then he was on his feet, breath ragged. The walker advanced, the tip of its spear gleaming with lethal promise. Eddard set his stance, ice held in front of him. He remembered how the walker had moved in the haunted forest, swift and deadly. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The swirl of battle, the cries of men, the moaning of wights. He heard them distantly, as though beneath water. All his focus narrowed to the pale creature before him. A final confrontation, either he would kill it or it would slay him. The walker feinted left, then spun right, spear aimed at Eddard's flank. He shifted accordingly, letting the spear glance off Ice's edge. The contact jarred his arms with a shock of icy numbness. He angled his blade up in a riposte, feeling the walker twist away once more, but not quite quickly enough. Ice bit into its side, slicing a thin furrow. The walker cried out, voice like a winter gale. A swirl of frosty mist drifted from the wound. Eddard pressed forward, hacking again. This time the walker managed to parry with the shaft of its spear, but the Valyrian steel cut partway through the frozen material. A sudden resonance, like striking glass, reverberated. The spear cracked, losing a chunk of its crystalline tip. The white walker staggered, momentarily off balance. Eddard seized the opening. With a shout, he drove ice toward its chest. The walker twisted, raising an arm in a desperate block. The sword's edge sliced through that arm with a sound like glass shattering. The limb fell away, dissolving into snowy shards that whirled in the cold air. The walker reeled back, a keening wail escaping its lips. Eddard followed through with a final downward cut, splitting the walker from shoulder to torso. The creature disintegrated, collapsing into glittering fragments. A gust of wind scattered them across the snow. For several heartbeats, Eddard stood panting, gripping ice with numb fingers. His horse had fled, and men nearby were still locked in combat with wights. But that white walker was gone, undone by Valyrian steel. He felt a surge of relief, quickly tempered by exhaustion. One white walker was dead, yet how many roamed the battlefield or the wilderness beyond? A bellow caught his attention. He turned to see Robert, unhorsed as well, hammer in hand, standing above a pile of shattered bones and rotting flesh. 2 of the king's knights lay nearby, unmoving. Robert had apparently fought his own cluster of wights, possibly including another walker. Eddard sprinted over, ignoring the protests of his burning lungs. Robert stood, chest heaving, scanning the battlefield. "They're retreating," he gasped, pointing his hammer at the undead that remained. Indeed, the wights that still moved were backing off, shambling away to regroup beyond the tower's perimeter. The men from Oakenshield advanced carefully, spears lowered, finishing off stragglers. The skirmish seemed to be winding down. "We lost good men," Robert muttered, "but we held the tower." His gaze raked over Eddard, noticing the frost rimming his cloak and the exhausted set of his face. "You fought a walker?" "Aye," Eddard replied hoarsely. "It nearly skewered me." He glanced at the swirling masses of wights now in retreat. "They're pulling back again. It's the same tactic, they test, then withdraw, never fully committing." Robert spat onto the snow, which steamed faintly in the frigid air. "Let them run. We've done what we came to do." He braced a hand on Eddard's shoulder. "But gods, this can't continue forever. We can't be racing to every tower, every fort. They're trying to wear us down." Eddard nodded, well aware. "We can only hope Tywin Lannister, Hoster Tully, and the others arrive soon. A larger force might let us mount a coordinated defense along the entire wall. Perhaps we can even push beyond the wall in a real offensive." Robert grimaced, expression shadowed. "Push beyond the wall? We'd be in the others' domain. And how do we kill them all? The wights don't stay dead unless burned or struck with obsidian. Still, maybe with enough men we can carve a path. We can't stay on the defensive forever." They spent the next hour securing Oakenshield Tower, gathering the wounded. A grim tally revealed that nearly 100 men had fallen in the rescue attempt. Among them were knights from the Stormlands, a few of the North's stout-foot soldiers, and a dozen Black Brothers. The fortifications at Oakenshield were severely compromised, large sections of the palisade nothing but ice-rimed splinters. The men who'd been holding the tower thanked Robert for his timely intervention, but sorrow hung heavy. The footprints of the retreating wights led west where the wilderness thickened. Eddard suspected more White Walkers lurked in that direction, or deeper, orchestrating these attacks in some patient design. By dusk, they returned to Castle Black with the wounded. Word soon spread of the successful relief at Oakenshield, giving the garrison a small measure of hope. At least the men could see that the king himself was willing to fight in the thick of danger. Eddard overheard men praising Robert's bravery, comparing him to the heroes of old. But a gloom still fell over the fortress that night. Each clash took a toll in lives and resources, while the White Walkers seemed to lose nothing but expendable wights. And as the weather grew worse, supply lines might fail entirely. In the following days, the pattern repeated, sporadic assaults at different points along the wall, each time prying at defenses. Sometimes the undead threatened the gate, sometimes they struck near Eastwatch or the Shadow Tower, or at some smaller fort in between. The defenders rushed to fend them off, sustaining casualties each time. The White Walkers rarely engaged in large numbers, only enough to ensure that the living never found relief from the dread. Meanwhile, messages from the south hinted that Tywin Lannister's approach was slowed by storms and uncertain roads, though he pressed on with a considerable force. Hoster Tully followed behind with his Riverlanders. The Greyjoys were silent, no word from Pike. The Tyrells had promised men, but were likewise delayed. The Vale sent a few knights under Lord Yohn Royce, but they had yet to reach the Neck. Each day's waiting weighed heavily. Robert grew increasingly restless. Eddard often found him stalking the battlements, scanning the horizon with a scowl. They conferred regularly with the Lord Commander, considering new strategies. Some proposed a daring strike on the White Walkers' camp, but the Watchers reported that the main host was simply too large, spread in multiple pockets. Others spoke of searching for ancient spells rumored to exist in cryptic manuscripts locked away in citadel vaults or buried in the archives of Winterfell. But these were long-shot hopes, not immediate solutions. When a fresh wave of ravens arrived one morning with the news that Tywin was yet another week away, if not more, Eddard felt a despair creeping through him. They did not have a week's worth of men to lose at this rate. As he closed the message scroll, the memory of Benjen pricked at his mind once more. If Benjen was still alive beyond the wall, each passing day reduced his odds of survival. Eddard tried to banish the thought, telling himself he had a realm to safeguard, not just one brother to rescue. But in moments of quiet, guilt gnawed at him. Then, unexpectedly, a rider appeared from the north. It was near dusk when the Watchers on the ramparts spotted a lone figure on horseback racing across the snow from the direction of the haunted forest. At first, men assumed it must be a wight or a trick. Arrows were nocked. Torches were lit. But as the figure drew closer, some recognized the black cloak of the Night's Watch. Shouts rang out, confusion mingled with excitement. A patrol was dispatched outside the gates to intercept, ensuring it was not some undead infiltration. Eddard and Robert arrived in time to see the rider slump from the horse, half-frozen, mumbling incoherent words. A maester rushed forward with blankets and a waterskin. Soldiers carried the man into the courtyard, where braziers glowed. His face was battered, beard matted with ice, eyes glazed. Eddard knelt beside him. "Come yourself," he said quietly. "You're safe." "What is your name?" The man coughed, spitting blood-tinged spittle. "T-Tomard," he managed, voice hoarse. "Ranger from Eastwatch. Lost, we were hunting. White Walkers. They had a camp. Took men, including your brother." He trailed off, shivering uncontrollably. Eddard's heart lurched. He gripped the ranger's shoulder, attempting to keep him from collapsing. "Benjen Stark," he asked urgently. "You saw him?" Tomard swallowed, eyes flicking up with desperate intensity. "I saw a group, sea captives. They keep them, near a frozen lake, north of the Frostfangs." He paused, trembling. "Some are still alive, used for, I don't know, rituals. The White Walkers, they're gathering them, turning some into whites, but not all. I escaped. But the rest," he exhaled, and a rattling wheeze escaped his lips. "Benjen." I recognized him. Still breathing. They keep him in chains, the White Walkers, use him as bait or a sacrifice. I'm not sure. Eddard closed his eyes, relief and horror flooding him in equal measure. Benjen was alive, at least for now, but in the clutches of the enemy. Robert knelt down on the other side of the ranger. "Easy, friend. You've done well to come this far." Tomard nodded weakly, his eyes rolling back. He slumped, unconscious or near death. The maester checked his pulse, barking orders to others to carry him indoors, feed him broth, warm him by the fire. Eddard and Robert rose, exchanging a tense look. "This changes things," Eddard said, voice low. "If they're holding Benjen and other captives north of the Frostfangs, they must have a central base or ritual site. That might be the seat of their power, or at least a crucial stronghold." Robert's expression was grim. "You'll want to rescue him." "Yes," Eddard answered without hesitation. "But more than that, if the White Walkers are gathering captives for some foul purpose, it might be a chance for us to strike a real blow. They gather in one place, we can take the fight to them." Robert released a long breath, frosted in the cold. "We don't have the numbers for a full-scale expedition beyond the Frostfangs. But maybe a smaller force could sneak through. Hammer them before they realize we're there." "That's my thought," Eddard said, mind whirling. "We can't bring a huge army, or we'll be spotted and surrounded by whites. But if we take a select group of rangers, knights, men well armed with dragonglass, we might slip into their territory under cover of darkness or a storm. Free the captives, kill any White Walkers we find, and disrupt their plans." Robert grimaced. "It's a gamble, Ned. If you're caught out there in force, we can't rescue you. And Castle Black would lose some of its finest." "I know," Eddard replied softly. "But if the White Walkers are performing rituals to create more whites or something worse, we can't afford to ignore it. And I won't abandon my brother if there's a chance to save him." Robert looked away briefly, the muscle in his jaw twitching. Then he clapped a hand on Eddard's shoulder. "Very well. We'll prepare a strike force. I'll not forbid you from going, he's your brother, and you know these lands better than any southerner. But I'm coming too." Eddard started to protest, but Robert raised a hand. "Don't say I can't. I'm the king, and I'll fight for every man of this realm. You think I'll cower behind the wall while you try a heroic rescue? Besides, if we do manage to kill a few of these devils, I want to be there to see it." A reluctant smile touched Eddard's lips. He knew Robert well enough that no argument would sway him. "So be it," he said, gripping Robert's arm. "We'll gather a hand-picked company. 20, 30 at most. All with experience fighting whites or White Walkers, all with the best arms we have." Robert nodded. "We slip out at night, circle around their main host, and head for the Frostfangs. Let the Watchers see if the White Walkers notice our departure. With luck, they'll be busy planning their next siege, not expecting us to come for them." And so, in secret councils that night, Eddard and Robert formed their plan. They chose men from the Night's Watch, veterans who knew the northern wilds intimately, plus a handful of skilled warriors from the Northern Lord's retinues and Robert's personal guard. Among them was the Great John, who insisted on joining, swearing he would hack through 1,000 whites if it meant bringing home Ned's brother. Roose Bolton declined. He thought it an unnecessary gamble and claimed he was more useful reinforcing the wall. A few other seasoned fighters stepped up, some from the Vale, some from the Riverlands, men who had proven their mettle in battles past. In the end, a group of 28 was selected. Horses were to be used only part of the way, as the terrain in the Frostfangs might be impassable by larger mounts. They would carry as many dragonglass weapons, torches, and supplies as possible without slowing themselves too much. Secrecy was paramount. If the others realized what they intended, they might set a trap or move the captives. The men sworn to go said quiet farewells, left instructions for their belongings, and accepted that they might not return. Eddard left word with the Lord Commander that, if they did not come back in a fortnight, assume the mission failed. He had a brief moment with a crow that was meant to fly to Winterfell, bearing a short message of love for Catelyn and the children, as well as instructions in case of his death. It pained him, but he owed them that much. The night of departure, a blizzard mercifully blew in from the west, cloaking the world in swirling white. Under cover of that storm, Eddard's band slipped through a postern gate, leading their horses in single file. The watchers on the ramparts did their best to keep the undead's attention elsewhere, launching occasional arrow volleys and catapult shots. The swirling snow obscured vision so thoroughly that Eddard could barely see the man in front of him. That was precisely the advantage they needed, and yet he felt a sick dread in his gut. They were venturing into the domain of the others, far from the safety of the wall. Hour by hour, they traveled north, guided by black brothers who knew the lay of the land even in a storm. A few times, the wind howled so fiercely that they had to halt and brace themselves or risk losing each other in the dark. None spoke more than necessary. The howling gale would devour any words. Eventually, they turned northwest, skirting the edges of the haunted forest, heading for the foothills. Eddard prayed that the main White Walker host would not detect them. If even a few large patrols found them, they were doomed. The possibility of that weighed upon every step. By dawn, they had covered a decent distance, though the storm had slowed them. The blizzard died down to a steady snow, revealing the stark silhouette of distant mountains rising like jagged teeth. A hush settled over the land, broken only by the soft crunch of hooves. They made a quick camp in the lee of a ridge, feeding the horses small measures of oats. The men chewed on hard bread and strips of salted meat. None lit a fire. Smoke would be visible against the snow. They posted sentries, scanning the white expanse for any sign of undead. Eddard glanced at Robert, who huddled in furs, clearly unused to such biting cold. Their eyes met, and Robert managed a tight smile that did not touch his eyes. Still, neither wavered. They pressed on that afternoon, picking their way into the foothills. Under normal circumstances, climbing icy slopes with tired horses was challenge enough. Now, with the threat of White Walkers haunting every shadow, the journey felt surreal. Occasionally, they spotted a raven circling overhead or perched on a lone pine, black against the snow. It might be a wild raven or perhaps one of the other scouts. They could not know. All they could do was keep moving. Late in the day, they reached a narrow pass that threaded between two sheer rock faces. Wind howled through the gap like a banshee, blowing icy spindrift into their eyes. The Black Brothers said they would have to lead the horses on foot to avoid a treacherous patch of ice at the pass's center. As they began crossing, the Great John in the lead let out a sharp oath. He pointed at something half buried in the snow along the rock wall. Eddard moved closer to see. It was a cluster of corpses, frozen solid, dressed in ragged skins. Possibly wildlings or perhaps unfortunate watchers. Their bodies were contorted in positions of anguish, eyes open and milky. No sign of white animation, but men approached warily, dragonglass axes at the ready. A sniff of the wind told Eddard the corpses were old enough not to have fresh blood. But that didn't guarantee they wouldn't rise if the others commanded it. The group decided to burn them. Gathering what little dry kindling they had, they set the pile alight. Flames rose, sending oily black smoke into the twilight sky. Eddard's face was grim. This was a reminder that death lurked in these mountains, even if the others did not. They made camp beyond the pass, in a rocky hollow shielded from the worst of the wind. Men took turns on watch, every sense alert for the crunch of undead feet. Eddard slept in fitful snatches, half dreaming of Benjen's face behind bars of ice. At one point, he jolted awake, hand on the hilt of ice, certain he had heard an eerie moan. But the night was empty, only the wind. A second watchman reported nothing unusual, though a few swore the cold itself seemed malevolent. On the third day of travel, they climbed higher, venturing deeper into the Frostfangs. The ranger Tomard had said the captives were held near a frozen lake, though the precise location was unclear. They had only a rough map and the descriptions gleaned from Tomard's feverish ramblings. This far from the wall, The land was savage, dotted with jagged peaks and hidden valleys. The sun, when it appeared, was a feeble orb behind swirling clouds, offering no real warmth. In mid-afternoon, the men halted on a ridge overlooking a broad basin. Below, a glacial expanse reflected the gray sky, perhaps the lake they sought. Eddard felt his breath catch. From this vantage, he could see shapes moving on the ice. A scattering of figures, some kneeling or slumped, others patrolling. Through the drifting snow, he glimpsed what looked like an encampment along the shore. Tents or structures fashioned from ice. The distance was too great for clarity, but his heart hammered. This must be the site. He glanced at Robert, who nodded curtly, jaw tight. The group withdrew to the cover of pines, tying their horses well back. They would approach on foot, stealth being their best ally. The Great John offered to lead a few men around to the western flank, while Eddard and Robert took the main approach from the east, hoping to trap any White Walkers in a pincer. They spent an hour finalizing the plan, distributing dragonglass weapons among the best fighters. Nervous tension skittered in every man's eyes. They all knew that if the enemy discovered them too soon, they would be overwhelmed. Dusk began to fall as they crept down the ridge. The snow muffled their footsteps. Occasionally, Eddard paused, scanning the gloom for signs of wights or watchers. All he heard was the wind moaning between crags. Finally, they reached the edge of the basin, crouched behind a line of stunted pines. Eddard peered through the branches, mouth dry. The lake spread out before them, a sheet of ghostly ice with drifted snow patches. Near the shoreline, shadowy shapes formed a crude encampment, perhaps half a dozen dome-like huts of ice and piled stones, faintly lit by a weird bluish glow. Whites shuffled among them, while at least one White Walker loomed, tall and gaunt, its frosty flesh visible even at a distance. "That's them," Eddard whispered. Robert, beside him, gripped his warhammer so tight his knuckles were white. They counted at least 20 Whites in view, though there could be more. The Great John and his men would be approaching from the opposite side of the lake. The plan was to strike at the same time, splitting the undead defenders. Then they would search for the captives. The question was whether to attempt a stealth rescue or a sudden assault. Judging by the presence of Whites patrolling openly, sneaking in seemed unlikely. Robert gave a slight nod. "We charge. Quietly as we can, but once they see us, we must move fast. Keep an eye out for White Walkers. You kill them quick or you die." "Understood." The men murmured agreement. Eddard's pulse hammered. Once again, he led them in a silent approach, creeping across the icy ground. Each step threatened to crunch or slip, but they managed to stay low and steady. As they neared 100 yards from the nearest hut, a White emerged, turning its ghastly visage toward them. For a heartbeat, it stared, then let out a moan that rose into a shrill cry. The alarm was sounded. No time for subtlety. Robert growled. "Charge." The men rose as one, surging forward with weapons at the ready. Eddard sprinted across the ice, careful not to lose his footing. He glimpsed the White raising its arms, trying to shriek again. Then a Night's Watch ranger loosed a dragonglass-tipped arrow that caught it in the chest, crumpling it to the ground. Other Whites poured out from between the huts, some brandishing swords or spears crusted with ice. Robert's warhammer slammed into the first White that got close, shattering bone and sending fragments skittering. Another came at Eddard with a rusted axe. He sidestepped the blow, slicing ice across its torso. Cold, dead flesh split open, black fluid oozing. Eddard kicked the body away, scanning for White Walkers. He spotted one emerging from behind a dome-like structure. The creature's eyes flared. Then it gestured, and from behind it lurched a pair of Whites clad in partial black armor. Eddard's heart clenched. Night's Watch gear. Could they be fallen rangers? A thunderous roar echoed from the far side of the camp. The Great John had charged in from the west, his own men hacking at Whites from behind. Caught between two forces, the undead reeled. Eddard felt a surge of hope. This might work. They just had to keep the White Walkers from rallying their minions. He pressed forward, shouting for the men to push toward the huts. Each structure might contain captives. The Whites fought viciously, mindless of pain. Some were quickly dispatched with dragonglass or steel to the head. Others required repeated blows to go down. Robert fought at Eddard's side, the hammer rising and falling in lethal arcs, smashing skulls and severing limbs. Now and again, a White Walker darted into view. One black brother tried to engage it, only to scream as an icy sword sliced him from collarbone to waist. his flesh freezing on contact. The Great John roared a challenge, burying a dragonglass hatchet into the creature's back. It dissolved in a swirl of frosty shards, leaving the big man panting, ice crusting his beard. Meanwhile, Eddard spotted an opening in the chaos and dashed toward one of the largest huts. Inside, he found a cage fashioned from twisted wood and bone. Huddled within were several half-dead figures, men in rags, reeking of filth. Among them, he saw a gaunt face with black hair, Benjen. Eddard's heart leapt. His brother was pale, covered in bruises and frost burns, eyes sunken. But he was alive. Benjen's gaze flicked up as Eddard rushed closer. Recognition flashed in those gray eyes, and a faint, hoarse whisper escaped his lips. "Ned Gods, you came." His voice was weak, but tears welled in Eddard's eyes. He knelt and hacked at the bone lattice with his Valyrian blade, cracking it apart. The men inside moaned or shrank back. Eddard forced a piece of cloth into Benjen's hand. "Hold on, I'll get you out. The others, can they walk?" Benjen coughed painfully. "Some can, others took so many for their rituals." He trailed off, voice ragged. Eddard broke enough of the makeshift cage to drag his brother and 2 other captives free. Outside, the clash of steel and the hiss of frost magic continued. A swirl of wind cut through the hut, carrying a rank smell of decay. "Lean on me," Eddard said, supporting Benjen's weight. The other 2 men, ragged wildlings by the look of them, stumbled along. Eddard would worry about their allegiances later. For now, they were fellow captives, victims of the White Walkers. He half-carried Benjen out into the open. Another White Walker had appeared, unleashing a blast of bitter cold at a cluster of men near the lake's edge, freezing them in place. Eddard swore, pulling Benjen aside. Robert thundered by, hammer raised, determined to smash the walker, but was forced to dodge a lunging White. The Great John flung a torch, igniting part of a dome structure. Flames caught quickly, casting dancing shadows on the ice. One after another, huts began to burn. Eddard saw men freeing additional captives from smaller enclosures, perhaps half a dozen more. Some were wildlings, some wore the Black Cloak. He recognized none but felt relief that the rescue had succeeded in saving more than just Benjen. "Retreat," one of the rangers shouted. "We have them. Fall back." Eddard realized they had done what they came for. Any further fighting might draw more undead from nearby. They had destroyed at least a handful of White Walkers, but many Whites still lurked around. Succeeding in the rescue was victory enough. Eddard nodded, ushering Benjen across the ice, calling for the others to withdraw. A cluster of men fanned out, warding off Whites. Robert hammered another undead soldier to shards, then fell in with them. The Great John bellowed at the top of his lungs, beckoning his men to the western side, ironically close to where they had come in. The entire expedition converged, dragging the captives along. Flames lit the falling snow behind them, a swirl of black smoke rising from the burning huts. Eddard saw at least 1 White Walker vanish into the shadows, leaving Whites to fight a rearguard action. They reached the basin's edge. Some men had already begun running up the slope, half-carrying wounded. Eddard urged Benjen onward, though his brother's steps were unsteady. "We'll get you to warmth soon," Eddard said, voice breaking. "Just hold on." Benjen gave a weak nod, mind clearly reeling. Whites pursued them, but the living had momentum and the advantage of dragonglass arrows. Here and there, archers loosed shafts, dropping pursuers in their tracks. A White Walker in the distance raised a spear, but several men fired at once, forcing it to dodge. This gave the expedition time to scramble over the ridge. Then they were beyond immediate reach, slipping back into the forest gloom. The wind keened in the mountains as if lamenting the loss of prisoners. They pressed on through the night, determined to put as many leagues as possible between themselves and the lake. Some men carried the unconscious or grievously wounded. Benjen managed to walk a short distance before collapsing. Eddard and another ranger fashioned a makeshift sled from branches, hauling him along. Exhaustion hammered at them all, but none dared linger until they were certain the White Walkers were not at their heels. Only when dawn lightened the sky did they pause to build a sheltered camp. The men huddled in a half-cave under a rocky overhang, using cloaks and whatever brush they could gather as insulation. Guards were posted in all directions. Eddard sat near Benjen, pressing a warm cloth to his brother's forehead. The younger Stark trembled, eyes flickering open at times, mumbling about ice, about captivity. Robert, battered and weary, joined them. He knelt, offering a waterskin. "Here, Ned. Let him drink." Eddard helped Benjen sip a little water. Robert studied the younger Stark's face and shook his head. "He's in rough shape, but he'll pull through if he can fight off the cold in his body." Eddard nodded, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "He will. He's strong." He glanced around at the other freed prisoners, who crouched near a small fire. The wildlings among them eyed the knights warily, but so far no trouble had erupted. They were too broken to fight. He said the White Walkers have been gathering captives for rituals, likely converting some to whites, maybe doing something else with others. It's evil beyond imagining. Robert's face hardened. "Well, we tore a hole in that, burned their cursed huts, freed some men. Let that be a lesson to them. They aren't unassailable." He paused, letting a weary grin cross his features. "Damn if that wasn't the bravest mad thing we've done yet, Ned." A faint smile touched Eddard's lips. "Mad indeed, but we needed some kind of victory, however small. And you saved Benjen's life. For that, I am forever grateful." Robert waved a hand, but Eddard saw the warmth in his eyes. "We all did our part. The Great John is near unstoppable. I swear he was hacking whites in half with each swing." His grin faded. "But we lost men, too. I counted at least 4 dead, half a dozen badly wounded. This was a costly rescue. Even so, it's a success. And we'll likely face pursuit," Eddard added, sobering. "We can't linger. Another day or 2 of rest. Then we head back to the wall by the safest route." He stroked Benjen's hair, which was clumped with dirt and ice. "Then we rejoin the war. I only pray Tywin's force arrives soon." Robert settled onto a rock, grimacing at a bruise on his shoulder. "Yes, because the White Walkers won't wait long before they strike again." He tossed Eddard a small chunk of dried meat. They ate in subdued silence, the crackle of the meager fire their only solace. Above them, the bleak sky churned with low clouds, promising more snow. At least that might cover their tracks from immediate detection. In the days that followed, they traveled southward, taking a circuitous path to avoid known clusters of undead. Benjen improved slowly, able to walk with help. Occasionally, the group fought off small groups of wandering whites, dispatching them swiftly with arrow or axe. The captives who had been freed started to regain some spirit. 1 or 2 wildlings even volunteered to help scout, claiming they wanted revenge on the others. The Great John laughed heartily at that, remarking how a common enemy could unite all folk of the north. On the 4th day, near dusk, they encountered the remains of a White Walker patrol. A half-dozen whites lay strewn about, dismembered, and no living men in sight. Tracks in the snow suggested a fierce struggle had taken place. Eddard and Robert exchanged baffled looks. Another force fighting the White Walkers? Or perhaps a schism among the undead themselves? The idea seemed absurd, but the evidence was plain. A few obsidian arrowheads were lodged in the whites, though they were crude, not of the style used by the Watch's blacksmiths. Could it be a large wildling force or a separate ranger party? They found no answers, only more questions. Finally, after nearly a week of careful travel, they glimpsed the distant outline of the wall. Relief flooded through the men, though the air remained tense. In that time, they had not seen a single White Walker in force, which likely meant the main host still focused on Castle Black or other points. The final stretch of the journey was grueling, but at last they crested a rise and saw the black bulk of Castle Black, tiny in the distance. Smoke rose from its chimneys. Eddard felt tears of gratitude burn at his eyes. They were home, or the closest thing to home in this frozen war zone. Just as they approached the wall, horns sounded from the battlements. The Watchers recognized the returning company. The gates swung open, revealing men in black cloaks and some of Robert's knights rushing out to greet them. A cheer rose when they realized the band had succeeded and that Benjen Stark was among them, battered but alive. Eddard helped his brother across the threshold, fighting back a surge of emotion. He had taken this risk for Benjen, and somehow they had prevailed, at least for now. Inside, the fortress had changed. The courtyard teemed with new faces, men of the Westerlands sporting lions on their surcoats and Riverlanders with the Tully trout. Tywin Lannister and Hoster Tully had arrived. Eddard spotted banners fluttering from improvised poles, and the entire place hummed with activity. He felt a surge of relief. Reinforcements at last. But how many? Were they enough to change the tide? A steward hurried up to them, bowing to Robert and Eddard. "My lords, Lord Tywin Lannister and Lord Tully request your presence in the main hall. They arrived 2 days past. They say your ravens have been waiting." Robert managed a grin despite his fatigue. "Good. Let them wait no more. We have news for them as well." He clapped Eddard on the shoulder. "Go, see Benjen to the maesters. Then come join me. We have a war council to attend." Eddard nodded. He led Benjen away, each step feeling like a small miracle. They passed columns of newcomers in the yard, some gaping at the battered company who had just returned. Among those stares, Eddard saw fear and curiosity. The tale of his rescue mission would spread quickly, no doubt. But if the realm had indeed begun to muster in earnest, if men were pouring in from the south, then maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance to defeat the White Walkers. Or at least to meet them in open battle. He helped Benjen to the maester's chamber, then paused, feeling a moment of overwhelming gratitude. His brother was alive. He had defied impossible odds. This single success might kindle a new spark of hope for all who fought in the north. But the war was far from won. Many battles lay ahead. The others would not remain idle. The future of Westeros hinged on the decisions made in the coming days. Still, for one fleeting moment, Eddard allowed himself a deep breath of relief. When he turned to go, his gaze swept over Castle Black's courtyard. So many men, so many banners. It was a sight reminiscent of a great southern tourney, yet overshadowed by the knowledge that the real foe was neither mortal nor merciful. The White Walkers would come again and in greater force. But Eddard Stark stood ready. He gripped the hilt of ice, recalling how it had cut down a White Walker at Oakenshield, reminding him that these creatures, for all their power, were not invincible. Together with Robert and the united might of the realm, House Stark would fight to defend the living. That was the vow he carried in his heart as he made his way to the War Council, prepared to shape the final stage of this conflict, no matter how terrible the cost. Eddard Stark lingered a while beside his brother in the maester's chamber, reluctant to abandon Benjen's side so soon after snatching him from the white jaws of death. Yet the news of Tywin Lannister's arrival, together with the Tully host, demanded his presence in council. His brother had fallen into a deep sleep, half delirious from the cold and the awful injuries he had sustained in captivity. The maesters hovered, applying salves to the frostbitten patches of skin, feeding him broth mixed with potent herbs. Eddard pressed a hand to Benjen's shoulder one last time, murmuring his relief that he yet lived, then straightened and turned away. Duty called. He walked through Castle Black's dim corridors, past weary men huddling in corners to catch a moment's rest. Though the fortress was now swarming with newcomers from the south, attention still clung to the air, heavy with the memory of recent battles and the promise of more to come. Eddard passed open doors that revealed glimpses of makeshift wards for the wounded. He paused once to help a limping soldier whose bandaged legs stained a dark spot upon the wrappings. The soldier nodded in thanks, then hobbled on to his billet. Eddard exhaled, wishing he could offer more than a fleeting bit of aid, but he was no maester. Outside, the courtyard seethed with activity. He emerged into a swirl of wind that rustled the cloaks of men practicing sword work by torchlight. Even the day's faint sun offered little warmth in this place. The larger portion of the newly arrived army was encamped just beyond the wall on the southern side, occupying temporary huts and hastily erected pavilions. Within the castle itself, ranks of Lannister guards, gleaming in their crimson-trimmed armor, mingled with the Riverland men, many sporting the leaping shroud of House Tully. Eddard also spotted some northern sigils as well as a smattering of Stormland banners for Robert's personal retinue. The King's Stag device was everywhere, signifying that Robert Baratheon now led a truly unified force of the realm, or at least the largest fraction of it. Still absent were the Tyrells in any sizable numbers, as well as the Greyjoys, who had sent no word. Dorne likewise seemed silent, or at best half-hearted. But it was something far more swords and men than the North could ever have mustered alone. Men offered Eddard respectful nods as he strode toward the Great Hall. Though this was not Winterfell, Castle Black's main hall had been repurposed for war councils and feasts alike. He reached the doors, thick planks reinforced with iron, where a pair of Lannister guards stood. At his approach, they pulled the doors open, revealing the warm glow inside. The press of voices washed over him. He stepped in and paused on the threshold, his breath pluming faintly in the vestiges of cold air that clung to the open doorway. A broad wooden table had been laid out at the hall's center, upon which maps of the north and beyond the wall were pinned or weighted with stones. Around it stood King Robert, broad-shouldered in a fur cloak, Tywin Lannister with the gold of his hair turned almost white in the torchlight, Lord Hoster Tully, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and several other High Lords who had come north. It was a remarkable gathering of men who had only recently been on different sides of the rebellion. Now they stood united against a threat older than any petty feud. Eddard moved closer, noting that Robert had a hand braced on the table as if fighting impatience. Tywin's face was unreadable, set in its usual mask of cool calculation. Hoster Tully's eyes flicked to Eddard and softened slightly in greeting. The Lord Commander, wearing his black cloak pinned at one shoulder, scanned Eddard's expression as though seeking fresh tidings. "Ned," Robert called, voice booming. "There you are. I was about to send someone to drag you out of the Maester's tower." Eddard inclined his head. "Apologies, Your Grace." "My brother." Robert waved a dismissive hand. "I understand. You did well rescuing him. I told these others about your mission beyond the wall. They were half ready to call you mad, but the results speak for themselves." He fixed Eddard with a purposeful gaze. "Now we must plan the next move. Lord Tywin has brought a sizable army, as has Lord Tully, but we remain uncertain how best to deploy them. Tell us what you know of the White Walkers' positions." Eddard joined them at the table, leaning over the spread of maps. His eyes flicked from one face to another. Lord Tywin's green stare was cool, vaguely challenging. Hoster Tully managed a faint, almost fatherly smile. Other lords included the great Jon Umber, towering behind them, and Ser Brynden Tully, known as the Blackfish, who had returned from Eastwatch after ensuring stability there. A hush fell as Eddard gathered his thoughts. "They remain massed in large numbers beyond the central portion of the wall," he said. "We've seen them test our defenses repeatedly. They also send smaller bands to harass the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch. My sortie uncovered that some White Walkers had established a kind of base or camp in the Frostfangs, at least temporarily, where they kept living captives. We burned those huts and freed the prisoners. It forced them to relocate, but that doesn't mean they've weakened." The Lord Commander gave a slight nod. "Our own scouts confirm large movements in the haunted forest. The Whites are innumerable. Many appear to be former wildlings raised into servitude. But these are only part of the threat. The others themselves, White Walkers, are fewer but far more dangerous. They coordinate the Whites' attacks and wield that infernal cold magic." Tywin glanced at Robert. "We should consider taking the fight to them before they can organize further. The combined strength of our newly arrived forces should suffice to crush them in open battle, assuming we can find them on ground that suits us." Eddard sighed softly. "My lord, open battle beyond the wall favors them. The cold is deeper, the terrain more treacherous, and they do not tire. Even if we muster every sword you brought, we risk being surrounded or bled dry. This is not an enemy like the Targaryens or rebellious lords." Hoster Tully cleared his throat. "Then what do you propose, Lord Stark?" "Another defensive stand upon the wall." "The wall is our greatest advantage," Eddard replied. "Its height and thickness, the vantage for archers, the old magic woven into its ice. Some say it has wards that repel the dead, though the White Walkers have attempted to crack it in places. If we hold it in strength along its length, the others cannot pass into the realm so easily." Robert scowled, drumming his fingers on the table. "So we just wait? Let them keep chipping at us with small raids? Our men will freeze or lose heart. We'll run out of wildfire, out of obsidian. I want an end to this, Ned, not a slow bleeding." Tywin's thin mouth curved in a hint of a smile. "A slow bleed is exactly what the White Walkers want. Our armies mass here, idle and uncertain, while they expand their numbers. Meanwhile, the lords in the south grow restless. We are vulnerable to any who might seize advantage in our absence." Eddard ground his teeth. He hated admitting that Tywin had a point. "We cannot simply charge into the true north with all our forces. We risk calamity, but perhaps we can attempt a decisive strike if we identify a key location, like the Frostfangs camp. If we find where the White Walkers gather or the source of their necromantic powers, we can deliver a crippling blow." Lord Commander Mormont, for that was his name, though the story has referred to him only as the Lord Commander, ran a hand over his grizzled beard. We have rangers seeking exactly that information, but the forests are vast and laden with snow. It could be weeks or months before we pinpoint some central seat of power. Time is not on our side. The Great John rumbled from behind them, crossing his huge arms. Let them come at us in one grand assault, then. We'll be ready. We'll fill the air with obsidian shafts and greet them with steel. Show them what real men can do. Tywin's eyes flicked toward the giant Northmen. And if they attack along the entire wall at all castles at once? A hush settled. Robert finally shook his head. We can't hold every mile of it. For thousands of years, the Watch has manned only 3 castles. The rest are abandoned. Tywin is right, even if it pains me to say it. We cannot be everywhere. Hoster Tully's voice came quietly. I'd rather not risk splitting our forces, but if the White Walkers do force engagements at Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, we must be in a position to reinforce quickly. Coordination is key. They circled through possibilities, testing each strategy. Some lords grew impatient, voices rising as they argued. Tywin Lannister pressed for a more aggressive approach, contending that a protracted siege favored the others. The northern lords insisted that leaving the wall en masse would invite disaster. Robert oscillated, torn between the counsel of caution and his longing for decisive victory. Eddard tried to remain calm, reminding them all that the White Walkers' greatest strength was fear itself, which they exploited with cunning raids. At length, a plan emerged, imperfect but better than none. They would heavily garrison the 3 main castles along the wall: Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower. Tywin Lannister, with a contingent of Westermen and Riverlanders, would command at Castle Black beside King Robert. Hoster Tully would move to Eastwatch with a portion of the Tully host and some knights from the Crownlands, while the Great John Umber and a strong force of northern men would reinforce the Shadow Tower. Each fortress would have ravens ready to dispatch calls for help if the White Walkers attacked in force. Meanwhile, the Lord Commander would coordinate scouting parties beyond the wall, seeking any sign of a White Walker stronghold. If and when they found it, Robert would lead a swift, targeted offensive with select forces from all 3 garrisons converging by forced marches or even by ship from Eastwatch if that proved faster. The risk was obvious. It meant dividing their armies among 3 points, but it also ensured that no single castle stood alone. If one castle was besieged, the others would come to its aid. With Dragonglass shipments continuing to trickle in from Dragonstone, they might just keep pace with the demands for weapons. Before the meeting dispersed, Tywin cleared his throat. And what of the Iron Islands and the Tyrells? We have heard little from them. If the Greyjoys choose to raid our coasts while our forces are up here, it could be catastrophic. My scouts in the west indicate no major movement, but Balon Greyjoy is a cunning foe. As for the Tyrells, rumor says Mace Tyrell might be dithering behind the Honeywine. If you want their men, your grace, you may need to apply direct pressure. Robert set his jaw. I've already sent ravens to Highgarden and Old Town urging them to bring forces north. The Citadel is at Old Town and the Maesters must realize the threat. Perhaps they'll push Mace to do his duty. As for the Iron Islands, if they cause trouble, so be it. We'll punish them once we're done saving the realm from the undead. Eddard suppressed a grim smile. That was Robert always spoiling for a fight. They had no choice but to trust that the Greyjoys would either remain idle or attempt something petty that could be contained by local garrisons. No one had the luxury of focusing on them now. When the plan was set, the men broke apart. Eddard slipped out into the corridor, noticing that the entire council had taken nearly half the day. Outside, the sky's light had shifted into the pale cast of late afternoon as the northern sun dipped early behind the horizon. He felt the fatigue of weeks of strain, the aches from the fighting at Oakenshield Tower, the rescue mission, and the endless tension of leadership. At times he missed the simpler days of his youth, but those days had vanished when the realm erupted in rebellion and the White Walkers returned from legend to plague the living. Even so, he found a moment's solace in checking on Benjen again. The Maesters had him propped on furs, a bowl of hot broth in his hands. He looked up at Eddard's approach, face gaunt but more alert. Ned, he whispered, voice rasping, did I dream it? Or did you truly come for me in that freezing pit? You did not dream, Eddard said softly, seating himself on a stool beside the cot. We found you at that cursed lake in the Frostfangs. You're safe now. Rest. Benjen's eyes flickered, memories clearly haunting him. They, the White Walkers, used to appear sometimes, watching us. They'd speak in voices of ice, though I barely understood. I only know the terror in that sound. I thought they would kill me, turn me, or worse. Eddard gently gripped his brother's hand. But that fate did not come to pass. You're still yourself, Benjen Stark. He hesitated. If you can remember anything about their plans, anything they said or did, tell the maesters. We must gather all knowledge if we are to prevail. Benjen nodded weakly. When I'm strong enough to speak at length, I will. He sipped his broth, then paused. Thank you, Ned. It was a simple statement, but Eddard's throat constricted with emotion. He had lost so many loved ones. His father, his brother Brandon, his sister Lyanna. He would not lose Benjen, not if he could help it. He gave Benjen's shoulder a last comforting squeeze, then rose and slipped out again, letting him rest. In the coming days, the combined host settled into its new distribution. The Great John departed with a large force to bolster the Shadow Tower, departing in a caravan of wagons and marching columns that stretched across the horizon. Hoster Tully and Ser Brynden prepared to move eastward, accompanied by a formidable retinue from Riverrun, as well as knights from the Crownlands led by men once loyal to Aerys but who had since bent the knee to King Robert. At Castle Black, Tywin took up partial command under the king's banner, often conferring with Robert in tense, quiet exchanges. Eddard stayed at Robert's side, a voice of caution whenever Tywin pressed for more aggressive measures. The Lord Commander busied himself organizing scouting patrols. Ravens flew in and out of Castle Black's rookery at all hours, carrying updates and pleas for more supplies. The winter storms continued, but not quite as fiercely, offering a few days of relative calm. Though the others did not mount any massive attacks during this period, the scouts often reported small skirmishes. Whites roamed the forest in roving packs, sometimes guided by a White Walker or two. Rangers picked them off when they could, but the cost in lives mounted. The watchers in the high towers occasionally glimpsed large gatherings of undead drifting across the plain, only to vanish into the gloom again. It felt like the quiet before a greater storm. One late afternoon, as Eddard stood upon the ramparts with Robert and Tywin, scanning the horizon through the swirling snow, a raven arrived from Eastwatch. The bird's message, once deciphered, contained urgent news. A White Walker force had probed the outer ramparts in a surprise push. The Tully host had arrived just in time to reinforce the gates, driving off the undead. But they had lost dozens of men, and the White Walkers had retreated only after unleashing a wave of unnatural frost that nearly shattered part of Eastwatch's outer wall. It was another demonstration that the others had ways of undermining even thick fortifications. Eddard felt a chill run down his spine. If they concentrated that power at one point of the wall for long enough, could they break it entirely? Tywin handed the scroll back to Robert with an air of silent reproach, as if to say, we should meet them beyond the wall, or we risk losing everything. Robert looked away, frustration evident. Eddard quietly advised that Eastwatch would hold, but if a larger assault followed, they would need to scramble forces from Castle Black or the Shadow Tower. That night, the War Council reevaluated the plan and decided that a partial relief column would be prepared at Castle Black to ride east on short notice if another major push occurred. The same logic applied to the west. For now, that was all they could do. Despite the gloom, morale in Castle Black was not entirely bleak. The presence of fresh southern troops eased the burden of daily watch rotations, giving exhausted men some respite. The knights saw small gatherings around hearth fires, where men from different corners of Westeros swapped tales of past battles, boasted of their families' reputations, or shared black humor about the chill that had replaced the Targaryen dragons. Eddard often found himself seated near Robert, listening quietly while the king tried to inspire men with stories of the rebellion's triumph or the power of House Baratheon's lineage. Sometimes Tywin would stand at the periphery, silent and aloof, measuring each conversation. At other times, men from the north clapped Eddard on the back, toasting the rescue of Benjen, praising House Stark's unwavering leadership. Eddard seldom felt comfortable in the spotlight, but he recognized the necessity of encouragement in dark times. Benjen's health improved enough that he could walk unaided, though slowly. One evening, Eddard found his brother standing by a brazier in the courtyard, wrapped in heavy furs, gazing up at the towering face of the wall. The last color of sunset flickered across the ice, turning it a faint pink in places. Snow drifted down around them in a lazy hush. Eddard approached, touched Benjen's arm gently. You should be inside warming yourself. The maesters wouldn't approve of you shivering out here. Benjen managed a small smile. I've done nothing but lie abed for days. My body aches for some movement and my mind for fresh air. Besides, I used to dream of standing here as a proper ranger, defending the realm. Eddard followed his gaze up the colossal ramparts. The realm needs every able body it can muster. But you've endured a horror few can imagine. No one would fault you for returning to Winterfell to recover. Benjen shook his head, expression resolute. No, Ned. My place is here, with the watch. I swore an oath. And I've seen what's out there. I won't shirk my duty. A surge of pride and worry mingled in Eddard's chest. He placed a hand on Benjen's shoulder, meeting his eyes. You are a Stark through and through. But be careful. The others watch for weakness. If you do rejoin the Rangers, take a small assignment at first. I beg you not to hurl yourself into danger before you've fully healed. Benjen hesitated, then nodded. Aye, I'll heed your counsel. His gaze fell to the side where 2 Lannister guards trudged past on patrol. Look at us, Starks, Tullis, Lannisters, Baratheons. The realm has never been so united in my lifetime. It's a shame it took the return of monsters to make it happen. Eddard sighed. The realm has been through enough strife. If only we can survive this, perhaps we can build a peace that outlasts our generation. They stood there in companionable silence a moment longer. Then a horn's call echoed from above, signaling the return of a scouting party. Eddard gave Benjen's shoulder a final squeeze, then headed off to the main gate, bracing himself to hear fresh tidings of Whites or shifting White Walker patrols. There would be no real rest until the final confrontation was at hand. As it happened, the scouting party brought mixed news. They had discovered a large group of wildlings who had fled south, claiming that the White Walkers were gathering near a glacier to the north of the Milkwater. The wildlings insisted that something was happening there, some dark ritual that might be central to the others' power. It echoed what Eddard and his men had seen near that frozen lake in the Frostfangs. Could the White Walkers be forging new abominations or summoning some monstrous force? The next day, Robert convened another meeting. Tywin and the Lord Commander were present, as well as Eddard and a few key northern lords. Robert read the scouts' reports and hammered the table with a clenched fist. We can't keep letting them mass strength. If there is a location where they concentrate their vile sorceries, we must strike and destroy it. Tywin inclined his head. I concur, Your Grace. A direct blow at their heart. The question is, can we confirm the location sufficiently? We can't march an entire army blindly into the north. Eddard exchanged a glance with the Lord Commander. Perhaps a strong reconnaissance in force. Not the entire army, maybe. 1,000 men, hand-picked with enough rangers to navigate the terrain. They could confirm the White Walkers' position. If they find a real stronghold, they send word, and we muster a larger assault. But 1,000 men might be large enough to defend itself if attacked, or at least survive until reinforcements arrive. Robert's eyes lit with the idea of action. Yes, 1,000 men. We have that many to spare from Castle Black. Tywin, do you agree? Tywin steepled his fingers, measuring the proposal. We can't leave Castle Black stripped of defenders. But 1,000 is feasible, especially once Hoster Tully's men reinforce Eastwatch. If we do this, we should choose highly mobile units. Heavy cavalry will be useless in snowdrifts. Foot soldiers and archers, all with dragonglass gear. Perhaps some supply wagons with provisions for a sustained foray. The Lord Commander nodded. We'll send a cadre of the best Black brothers to guide them. I'll choose men who know the terrain intimately. Let us ensure the chain of ravens is secured, so if they discover the White Walker's lair, we'll know immediately. Robert pushed to his feet, restless with the surge of possibility. Excellent. Then we begin preparations at once. Who leads this force? A silence stretched. Tywin's gaze flicked to Eddard, then back to Robert. The king's expression was transparent. He wanted to lead personally, but had doubtless been cautioned that if he fell in an ambush, the realm would be headless at a critical time. Eddard stepped forward. Your Grace, let me command it. I know the winter terrain and I've led similar raids. If we confirm the location of their stronghold, you'll have your proof. Then you can bring the full might of the realm down upon them. Robert's jaw clenched. He shot a glance at Tywin, who gave a minute nod. Very well, Ned, but take care. I can't lose my Warden of the North. So it was decided that Eddard Stark would lead 1,000 picked men on a scouting offensive. The next days buzzed with activity as those men were chosen. Seasoned northern soldiers familiar with deep snow, rangers from the Watch, and a smattering of knights from the west and the Crownlands who had proven hardy. They gathered dragonglass arrowheads, spears, daggers, anything that might help against White Walkers. Sleds were built to carry supplies through terrain horses might not traverse. Some hardy northern Garons were selected for hauling, but the group would rely mostly on foot. Eddard worked tirelessly with the Lord Commander to finalize routes, coordinate ravens, and plan fallback points in case the White Walkers outmaneuvered them. Benjen came to Eddard one evening in the courtyard, leaning on a staff. A fresh bandage circled his neck where frost had burned him. "I want to go with you," he said quietly. "I can still track, and I know some of those passes. Let me serve." Eddard studied his brother's face, seeing the earnest determination. Part of him wanted to order Benjen to remain behind and heal, but he remembered his brother's vow. "You're not fully recovered," he replied. "We may face harsh conditions, forced marches. If you collapse out there..." Benjen shook his head. "I won't. The maesters say I'm mending well. My mind is clear, Ned. Don't turn me away when I can help. You need rangers who know how to move unseen." Reluctant admiration flickered in Eddard. Benjen was resolute. Denying him might do more harm than good. "Very well," he said softly. "But promise me you'll heed orders if your strength fails. We can't afford to lose you." Benjen allowed himself a tight smile. "You won't." Preparations continued until at last, on a gray morning, the scouting force assembled in Castle Black's courtyard. Men wore layered furs and cloaks over their mail, some with fur-wrapped boots. They carried bows, axes, or spears fitted with obsidian. A row of sleds stood loaded with casks of food, kindling, and extra arrows. The mood was grim but resolute. Eddard, clad in thick wolfskin, walked among them, checking final details. Robert approached, hammer across his back, but clearly not intending to ride out. The king clasped Eddard's arm in front of the men. "Return with word of their lair," Robert said, voice loud enough for all to hear, "and we'll come after you with every sword in the realm." "May the gods watch over you, Ned." Eddard bowed his head in respect. "We'll do our duty, your grace." He glanced at Tywin, who stood at the sidelines, expression inscrutable. Then he turned to the men. "We march." They exited the castle through the same gate under the wall that Eddard had used on his previous ventures, stepping once more into that stark, frozen land. The wind was brisk, the sky leaden. Behind them, the black silhouette of the fortress receded, dwarfed by the immense ice barrier rising above. Ahead lay miles of snow-choked forests, treacherous passes, and the knowledge that somewhere out there lurked an immeasurable host of the dead, commanded by cunning foes. They advanced in columns, the sleds at the center, watchers on each flank scanning the white horizon. That first day's march was uneventful, save for the typical hardships of winter travel. Eddard established a camp at dusk in a hollow beside a cluster of pines. Scouts fanned out to check for undead movement. Fires were carefully tended, the flames dancing red and orange in the gloom. Men whispered of the last time they had faced whites, the memory sparking fear and resolve alike. Eddard posted triple watches through the night, mindful that the White Walkers were most dangerous in darkness. He half expected an ambush, but no sign of the enemy appeared. They pressed on the next day, forging steadily north and a bit west. The scouts reported no large concentrations of undead in the immediate path. Perhaps the White Walkers' main strength still lay farther east, near the center of the wall. Eddard felt uneasy. He suspected the enemy might let them pass deeper, then cut off their retreat. In the afternoons, he consulted with the rangers to ensure they left behind hidden caches of supplies in case they were forced to backtrack. The men grumbled but complied, burying sealed food sacks in the snow, marking them carefully on sketches so they might find them again. Benjen proved an asset, quietly advising Eddard on which valleys or ridges might be less likely to hold ambushes. He pushed himself physically, occasionally pausing to catch his breath, but never complaining. Another ranger, Corin Halfhand, so named for his missing fingers, led the advance scouts, returning with reports of frozen creeks, game trails, or odd footprints in the snow that vanished abruptly. Once, they discovered a wildling hideout empty except for a dead goat and strange symbols carved in the ice. The men found it unsettling, but no whites lurked nearby. On the fourth day, the weather turned savage. A blizzard howled in from the west, driving needles of snow that stung exposed skin. The columns struggled to stay together as visibility dropped to near nothing. Eddard ordered them to hunker down, forming a tight ring with the sleds and building snow walls to break the wind. For 2 days, they remained pinned by the storm, forced to ration their food carefully. Men's spirits drooped, worrying that they were accomplishing nothing, only exposing themselves to the lethal cold. Eddard walked among them, speaking softly of the realm behind them, reminding them that this mission could spare thousands of innocent lives. If they located the White Walker's lair, the tide might change. Still, he felt the strain himself, and each hour he wondered if whites might stumble upon them in the swirling drifts. At last, the storm relented, leaving a pristine white silence. On the 7th day since leaving Castle Black, the skies cleared to a pale, watery blue. Corrin's scouts raced back to the main camp with urgent tidings. They had spotted a White Walker patrol less than a league away, heading north. The men quickly struck camp, burying any trace of the fires, and readied themselves. Eddard chose to shadow the patrol from a distance, hoping it might lead them to a larger gathering. In careful formation, they followed the tracks left by the White Walkers and their whites. The footprints were partially filled by blowing snow, but Corrin's sharp eyes found the trail, which wound through stands of gnarled trees and over a frozen stream. Twice they caught glimpses of pale shapes far ahead, whites shuffling, a tall figure gliding at their head. Each time Eddard signaled the men to halt, ensuring they stayed out of sight. The chase continued for hours, the White Walkers seeming either unaware or unconcerned about pursuit. Near dusk, the patrol they followed joined up with another group, forming a company of at least 50 whites and several White Walkers. The watchers hissed in alarm, counting the enemies from behind a ridge. Eddard cursed softly, aware that an open fight would be suicidal. Instead, he had them hold back as the undead pressed on into a narrow canyon. When Corrin ventured closer to the canyon's mouth, he spied more shapes deeper within, possibly a larger assembly. Eddard weighed the risk. If they approached by night, they'd be at a disadvantage. White Walkers seemed to see well in darkness, while living men floundered. But if they waited till dawn, the enemy might move on or discover their presence. At last he ordered a cautious night infiltration. A small vanguard, 50 men under Corrin, would creep forward to see what lay inside the canyon. The rest would form a defensive position on the high ground in case the whites poured out. Eddard himself joined Corrin's group along with Benjen and a handful of knights. They moved silently, cloaks dusted with snow so as not to stand out. Under the dim half-moon, they slipped into the canyon's entrance. The walls rose steeply on either side, lined with frozen waterfalls. The air was unnaturally still except for the faint crunch of their boots. Eddard smelled the tang of old ice, felt the prickle of dread. As they advanced, a flicker of bluish light glimmered up ahead. The men exchanged tense glances. Carefully, they edged forward until the canyon opened into a basin overshadowed by high crags. A cluster of whites stood in a semicircle around a massive block of ice that glittered with that eerie phosphorescence. 3 White Walkers were present, their gaunt forms clad in a strange armor that seemed to reflect the moonlight. One lifted a spidery hand and the whites collectively moaned. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. Eddard's heart pounded. He counted at least 100 whites in the basin, likely more. The throng parted, revealing something behind that massive block of ice, some shape that Eddard could not fully discern from this angle. It might have been a figure, or a cluster of corpses, or an altar formed of frozen remains. He glimpsed a faint red flicker in the ice, as though something burned or pulsed within. For a moment he thought of the heart trees of the old gods, but this was colder, more alien. The White Walker standing at the front extended an icy spear, and the whites stirred restlessly. It had the aura of a ritual, reminiscent of what Eddard had seen at the Frostfang's lake, some vile ceremony to bind or create new horrors. Benjen, crouched beside Eddard, muttered under his breath, this must be one of their gatherings. Could it be the seat of their magic? Or just another vantage? Eddard's mind churned. The mission was to locate a stronghold or critical gathering point. This might be exactly that. If they could slip away and report back, Robert could bring the combined armies to smash these fiends. But if they lingered too long, they might be discovered. Even now, the whites milled about and Eddard feared the faintest sound might carry. Then something happened that sent ice water through his veins. One of the White Walkers turned sharply, as if alerted. Its glowing blue eyes fixed on the shadows where Eddard and his men hid. Back, Eddard breathed, barely more than a whisper. Corrin nodded. The group eased away with agonizing slowness, trying to vanish into the gloom before the whites or White Walkers could pinpoint them. The basin's walls offered little cover, and Eddard's heart hammered with every step. At any moment, a shriek or hiss might announce that they'd been spotted. They crept around a bend out of direct sight. Another few steps and they could flee the canyon entirely. A sudden piercing wail knifed through the silence. Eddard winced, hands flying to his ears. The cry reverberated against the rock, more piercing than any horn. At once, the whites howled in response, a mass of throaty moans that turned into a collective roar. Then came the heavy thud of footsteps. The canyon was alive with the undead, and they were moving fast. "Run," Corin hissed, and the men broke into a sprint. They did not bother with stealth anymore. Eddard ran at the front, dragging Benjen by the elbow when his brother stumbled. Behind them, the flicker of torches and the shine of pale eyes told them the whites were in pursuit. Once or twice, Eddard glimpsed a white walker gliding up the canyon, its ice spear held aloft. A chill passed over him that felt colder than the winter wind. He urged the men onward, praying the main force outside the canyon was ready. They burst from the canyon mouth, breath steaming, hearts pounding. Ahead, the rest of the 1,000 men were arrayed on higher ground, alerted by the unholy shriek. Eddard waved his arms, signaling them to prepare for battle. Archers rushed to positions behind improvised barricades of ice blocks. Spearmen formed lines. Men shouted to each other, hurrying to ignite torches or secure dragonglass arrowheads. The whites poured from the canyon moments later, a black tide of rotting flesh and frost-rimed bone. Their moans rose to a hideous crescendo. Eddard's small vanguard joined the defenders, turning to face the onslaught. Archers, loose, bellowed a captain. A volley of dragonglass-tipped arrows arced across the snowy expanse, striking the leading ranks of whites. Some collapsed at once, others jerked in spasms before dropping. But more surged past, unfeeling. Another volley rained down, puncturing the shoulders and chests of the undead. Eddard drew ice, positioning himself near the center. Benjen gripped a bow with trembling hands, knocking a dragonglass arrow. Then the White Walkers emerged, half seen in the swirling darkness. Their eyes gleamed coldly, their movements preternaturally smooth. One lifted a curved blade of crystal, pointing it at the defenders. At that silent command, the whites accelerated, flinging themselves at the living ranks. The impact was brutal. Spearmen braced, skewering the first wave. Men gagged at the stench and pressed forward, trying to tear the whites apart or drive them back. Torches lashed out, lighting rotting limbs with flame. A dreadful cacophony of shrieks and cracks filled the air. Eddard slashed with ice, severing a white's arm at the elbow, then hacking another across the torso. He felt bone give under the Valyrian steel. Next to him, a soldier toppled backward as a white's clawed hand tore at his throat. Another man leapt in to drive a dragonglass dagger through the white's skull. The undead perished instantly, crumpling as though its strings had been cut. Yet more and more whites closed in, heedless of damage. Eddard shouted for men to hold the line, but pockets of chaos formed where whites broke through. A white walker soared forward, its icy feet skimming over the snow. It struck at a knot of archers with lethal grace, spinning its crystal blade to shatter steel weapons. Eddard pivoted, raising ice. "To me," he cried, charging the creature. 3 other men flanked him. The walker hissed, parrying Eddard's blow in a clash that sent a shock of cold through the metal. Another man tried to stab it with an obsidian spear, but the walker twisted aside, retaliating with a slash that slashed the man's chest open. He collapsed, dying instantly. Eddard launched another overhead strike, forcing the walker to block. Valyrian steel met frosted crystal in a ringing impact that sprayed shards of frost. The walker recoiled, perhaps surprised by the strength of the blow. Eddard pressed in, slashing again. The walker retreated a step, then flicked its wrist, sending a crackle of ice shards swirling at Eddard's legs. The ground under him turned slick, nearly toppling him. He fought for balance, swearing under his breath. Another soldier lunged with dragonglass from the side, nicking the walker's flank. With a shriek, it swept its blade in a lethal arc, catching that soldier in the shoulder. He went down in a gush of frozen blood. But Eddard seized the opening. He braced, stepped forward, and drove ice into the walker's torso. A sound like glass breaking rent the air. The walker's form cracked, splintered, and dissolved into shards, leaving a swirl of icy residue drifting on the wind. Eddard gasped for breath. The men around him let out ragged cheers, but the battle was far from won. White still poured forth, and at least 2 other white walkers were prowling the flanks. One was conjuring a swirl of frost near the barricades, threatening to freeze men in place. Another had seized a vantage on a small rise, commanding whites to circle around the defenders. The thunder of combat echoed through the night, lit by the glow of torches and the faint moon. Eddard barked orders, urging the archers to concentrate on the flanking whites. Each arrow that struck home dropped a monster, but for every fallen white, 2 more lumbered closer. Some men showed real valor. One knight from the west, a tall, wiry fellow with a lion sigil, hacked relentlessly with a dragonglass axe, cutting down white after white. Corin Halfhand fought near the left flank, swirling his sword with deadly efficiency. Benjen kept loosing arrows from behind a partial snowbank, each obsidian tip felling a white instantly if it found the head or heart. Yet the creatures advanced, unstoppable save for total destruction. "Fall back!" Eddard shouted at one point, seeing the line buckle. "Form a second rank." The men obeyed, retreating a few paces, still fighting as they went. They had no cavalry to speak of, this was all foot and archers. If the whites broke them entirely, the result would be a massacre. Eddard realized with sinking dread that the White Walkers might have more reinforcements in the canyon. They had to decide quickly whether to stand or flee. A horn blast rang out from somewhere behind the lines, a low bellow that signaled the arrival of more undead from the rear or perhaps fresh foes. Eddard whipped around, expecting the worst. But to his astonishment, he saw shapes moving on the ridge to the east, human shapes, many carrying torches. Could it be more men from Castle Black? That was impossible. They had no knowledge of his location. Then, as the shapes descended, Eddard realized these were wildlings. Dozens of them, some mounted on shaggy horses, others on foot, raising clubs or axes. The front rank held torches aloft. Their leader, a tall man with a cloak of animal pelts, lifted a crude spear. Eddard heard him bellow something in the free folk's rough tongue. Then the wildlings crashed into the flank of the whites. The undead reeled, momentarily distracted by this new onslaught. Eddard seized the opportunity. "Press them," he roared, and the men resumed their assault from the front. The wildlings from the ridge fought with reckless ferocity, hurling burning brands at the whites, hacking them with sharpened stone or old steel. Some had dragonglass tips, though it seemed crudely fashioned. Eddard found a moment to wonder how they'd obtain such knowledge. Then the swirling chaos of battle demanded his full attention. He ducked a scything blow from a white, severed its arm with ice, then pivoted to bury his blade in another's spine. The combined pressure of the two groups gradually forced the whites to falter. The White Walker on the small rise hissed, stepping backward. One of the wildling warriors flung a spear with an obsidian tip that struck the walker's arm. It screeched, white frost spraying. A volley of arrows from Eddard's archers followed, forcing the walker to vanish into a swirl of its own conjured mist. Then the whites lost their guiding intelligence, becoming more disorganized. Men and wildlings methodically put them down, using dragonglass or flame to ensure they stayed down. The moans and shrieks gradually died away, replaced by the ragged breathing of the living, the crackle of torches, and the hiss of dissipating frost. Eddard wiped a streak of congealed gore from his face, scanning the field. Bodies, both living and undead, littered the ground. A sense of mingled triumph and sorrow pressed on him. Another fight survived, but at a cost. The White Walkers had melted away, leaving only a scattering of re-dead whites. Men were already moving among the corpses, finishing off any that still twitched. Somewhere, a wounded soldier whimpered. He looked toward the wildlings. Their leader approached, flanked by half a dozen fierce warriors. They gazed warily at Eddard's men as though expecting hostility. Eddard stepped forward, lowering ice in a gesture of peace. The wildling leader was a broad-shouldered man with streaks of gray in his hair, wearing mismatched bits of hide and mail. He spoke in the harsh accent of the free folk. "We saw your fight. My folk have been trailing those dead ones for days, picking off their scouts. You fight well, for Kneelers." Eddard inclined his head. "We thank you. If not for your arrival, we might have been overrun." He recognized this was a precarious moment. Normally, wildlings and men of the Watch were mortal foes. But these were not normal times. "I am Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, sworn to keep the White Walkers from crossing into the realm." "Who are you, friend?" The man paused as if weighing whether to claim friendship. "Name's Hara. Our clan got scattered by the others in the mountains, so we banded together with others who survived. This war is bigger than your petty walls or our feuds. So we help if it means we can keep breathing. Then we share a goal," Eddard said calmly, forcing a flicker of warmth into his voice. "We must destroy these creatures or they'll kill us all. Will you talk with us?" Hara's eyes flicked between Eddard's men. The air was thick with mutual suspicion. Then the wildling gave a grunt. "I will talk, but keep your Kneelers' swords pointed elsewhere." He nodded toward the battered remnants of Eddard's force, who still bristled with tension. "We're not lambs for the slaughter. We helped you, that's enough for one night." Benjen limped closer, gaze scanning the wildlings with curiosity. "You fight the White Walkers well. Do you have news of their gatherings?" Hara spat on the ground. "We've run from them for months. They take villages, they raise the dead. We heard of a big muster near some giant ice spire in the far north. Might be the same place you were poking your noses into." He eyed Eddard. "I can show you the path if you want to see it for yourself. But it's a death sentence to go there alone." Eddard's pulse quickened. This might be the confirmation they needed. But they were in no shape to push onward after such a battle. "We'll rest here, bury our dead. Then we can talk about forging an alliance, or at least a truce, while we locate that spire. If it's as important as we suspect, we must destroy it." Hara shrugged. "We have no love for your lords and laws. But if you fight the dead, we'll stand beside you. After that, we go our own way." Agreed. Eddard nodded. Agreed. It was an uneasy partnership, but better than letting the free folk remain isolated and hunted by the White Walkers. Perhaps together they could strike a decisive blow in the heart of Winter's domain. So the battered scouting force set about cleaning up the battlefield. Torches were thrust into the remains of Whites, ensuring no chance of reanimation. Wounded men were carried to a makeshift camp near the canyon entrance. The wildlings mingled warily, helping gather salvaged weapons or search for any White Walker traces. Eddard found himself treating with Hara in a small circle of men. They shared a rough meal of dried meat and snowmelt. The wildlings told of the wretched experiences they'd endured, entire clans wiped out or turned into whites. The others had been systematically exterminating or enslaving all free folk in their path, forging an unstoppable army. Hara claimed many scattered pockets of wildlings remained, but they were leaderless and terrified. Eddard, in turn, explained the realm's stand behind the wall. He admitted that if the White Walkers broke through, all of Westeros would burn in an endless winter. Hara responded with bitterness that the Kneelers had always scorned the free folk, refusing to see them as fellow men. But faced with a threat that did not care about borders, maybe it was time to put aside grudges. Eddard agreed wholeheartedly. They parted for the night, with an unspoken understanding that the morning would bring new decisions. Dawn light revealed the devastation of the battlefield. Eddard counted at least 70 of his men dead, along with a number of wounded. He also saw dead wildlings scattered among the whites, a testament to their bravery. They dug shallow graves in the frozen ground or burned the bodies upon pyres to prevent them from rising if the White Walkers returned. The stench of burning flesh clung to the air. Meanwhile, Hara's folk did the same for their dead, chanting in low voices an old free folk dirge. It struck Eddard that this was the truest sign of their alliance, mourning side by side. When all was done, Eddard assembled his captains as well as Hara and a few wildling representatives. He laid out the map of the area. You mentioned an ice spire in the far north. That may be the heart of their power. If we find it and confirm the White Walkers gather there, we can send a raven to the wall for reinforcements. Then we muster a final assault. Without that knowledge, the king can't move an entire army on guesswork. Hara crouched, tracing a rough shape in the snow. We saw it from afar, near a place the free folk called the Frozen Vale. The spire was massive, rising out of a glacier, shining like the moon. There were whites everywhere. We turned back before they spotted us. But if you want to see it up close, we can lead you partway. Corin nodded. That matches rumors we've heard of a great glacier. But it's many leagues from here. Our supplies are not limitless. Eddard considered. We can't bring all our men. A smaller party has a better chance of slipping in, confirming the location, and sending a raven. The rest can remain here or move to a safer fallback point. If the White Walkers catch wind of us, a large group might be more visible. Benjen frowned. But you'll need enough strength if you run into trouble. One of the captains, a dark-haired Westerman named Ser Miles, spoke up. We might also consider that our battered forces need rest. A small scouting party is the best compromise. Let me lead it, my lord, and you remain with the main group. We can't risk you. Eddard shook his head gently. I appreciate the offer, Ser Miles, but I've pledged to find this stronghold. I'll go with the scouting party. We'll keep it to a handful of watchers, maybe a dozen men. The rest can fortify this camp or withdraw south if threatened. Hara, will your people guide us? Hara shrugged. Aye, but don't blame me if it turns into a ghost hunt. The spire might be guarded by worse things than you've seen. Eddard's eyes settled on Benjen. You'll remain here. I can't risk you again. You're still recovering and we need a steady hand to keep order if I'm gone. Benjen started to protest, but Eddard's gentle yet firm expression forestalled him. After a moment, Benjen exhaled, nodding resignedly. Very well, brother. But be cautious. By midday, Eddard had chosen 11 volunteers, rangers, watchers, and 2 men from the west. Hara agreed to bring half a dozen wildlings who knew the northern routes. Eddard entrusted command of the main force to Corin Half-Hand with instructions to hold or retreat as necessary, always preserving enough men to fight again. A single raven was readied. If Eddard found what he sought, he would dispatch a message with location details and Corin would send it to Castle Black. Then the king could muster. That was the plan, as tenuous as any plan in these haunted lands. So Eddard and his small band departed northward, guided by Hara and the other free folk. The land grew increasingly bleak, with minimal cover, just rolling plains of ice interspersed with broken ridges and the occasional line of frost-rimed trees. The wind would constantly, numbing fingers and cheeks. At night, they used minimal fires, relying on what little shelter they could find in rock crevices or behind snowdrifts. Eddard was reminded of the rescue mission to save Benjen, except now he ventured even deeper. At times, he wondered if he might ever see Winterfell or his family again. Hara's clan displayed cunning knowledge of these wastes. They showed the group how to find pockets of fresh water near certain ice ridges, how to sense the presence of crevasses by the quality of the snow. Twice they skirted columns of whites in the distance, using ridges to remain hidden. Once they spied a lone White Walker gliding across a frozen plain, apparently scouting. They hunkered down until it vanished. Each day, the temperature seemed to drop. Eddard began to suspect the White Walker's very presence leached warmth from the land. After what felt like a week, though the days blurred together, they reached a vantage point on a high, jagged slope. The afternoon sky was an endless gray vault overhead. From this perch, they looked out across a vast glacier that spread to the horizon. In the center stood something indeed like a spire, a towering formation of ice rising hundreds of feet. It glowed faintly, catching the diffuse light. Even from a distance, Eddard felt an unsettling aura emanating from it. Dark shapes moved around its base, likely whites or White Walkers. Hara crouched behind a boulder, pointing. That's the place. We've never gone closer than this. The free folk call it the Spear of Night. Rumor says it stands where the first White Walkers emerged in the long night, thousands of years ago. Eddard's breath came shallowly. Then it might be the cradle of their power. If we can confirm they're concentrating their forces there, we'll have our target. Corrin's men can carry the word south, and Robert can lead the realm's armies to destroy it once and for all. One of the rangers, a grim man named Byron, bit his lip. How close do we have to get? If we're spotted. We only need to observe enough to be certain, Eddard said softly. Then we release the Raven. We're not trying to fight them alone. Let's find a route that offers cover. After dark, we'll creep closer. Night fell slowly, the sky darkening to a bruised purple. They waited until the gloom was thick, then descended the slope. Hara led them along a winding path of ice ridges, carefully choosing where they placed their feet. Twice, the man behind Eddard nearly slipped into hidden crevasses, but the wildlings hauled him back at the last moment. The cold was brutal, stinging exposed flesh. Eddard's lungs felt raw. Still, they pressed on, determined to reach a vantage close enough to see the spire's base. At last, they peered over a shelf of ice. The spire loomed perhaps half a league away, a silhouette against the starless sky. Strange flickers of blue-white light danced along its surface, as if trapped reflections of a hidden fire. A wide plain of ice separated them from the spire. Dotting that plain were whites, dozens or perhaps hundreds, patrolling in uneven lines. And beyond them, next to the spire, a series of archways or tunnels carved into the ice. Eddard squinted. It looked almost like an ancient city, half buried under the glacier. He glimpsed shapes moving at the entrances, White Walkers, tall and silent. The entire scene radiated dread. He turned to one of the watchers who carried the Raven in a small cage strapped to his back. We've seen enough. We can confirm they're massing here. Prepare the message. The man nodded, carefully extracting a scrap of parchment and a charcoal stub. Eddard dictated a brief note. White Walker stronghold at Spear of Night. Possibly thousands of whites. Reinforcements needed immediately. He signed it and folded it tight. Before the Raven could be released, a hoarse whisper from Hara froze Eddard in place. Look there, the wildling said, pointing at a line of trudging figures approaching the spire from the north. The group huddled around something. Eddard strained his eyes, wishing for more light. Then his blood turned to ice. It was a column of captives, living men or women, their forms roped together, forced forward by whites. Among them glided a White Walker on a pale horse. Eddard saw the captives stumbling, some falling in the snow. The whites hauled them upright again. A few, unluckier, were dragged along. One captive's cry echoed faintly in the bitter air. They were being delivered to the spire, presumably for some dark purpose. The memory of Benjen's captivity stabbed Eddard. These people had little time before they were tortured or turned. Gods have mercy, a ranger muttered. We have to help them. Eddard's face twisted in anguish. They were only a handful of men, a fraction of the 1,000 who'd remained behind. Trying to rescue these captives from an entire army of whites would be madness. And yet the thought of leaving them to that horror tore at his conscience. He remembered how he had saved Benjen from a smaller encampment. Could a similar strike here be possible? The difference was staggering. This was the heart of the White Walker domain, patrolled by more whites than they could ever hope to best. Reason warred with compassion in Eddard's mind. Hara said quietly, "Go after them now, you'll die. Don't throw your lives away. We did that once for clan folk. Half of us were slaughtered." Eddard closed his eyes. He wanted to do something, but any attempt would be hopeless. They had discovered the stronghold. That was the critical mission. They had to get word to the king. Still, the notion of leaving captives to the tender mercies of the others gnawed at him like a wound. He forced himself to speak, voice trembling. "We cannot save them. Not now. We must warn the realm so that we can destroy this place entirely. The White Walkers have shown no mercy. Once we have the full might of Robert's armies, we'll break this spire to rubble and avenge those who have fallen." A grim acceptance settled over the men, though some cursed under their breath. The message was finished, tied to the raven's leg. The watcher stepped back from the ice shelf, preparing to release the bird. In that moment, Eddard heard a low rumble, like distant thunder. He tensed, scanning the horizon. The rumble rose, echoing off the glacier. At first he thought it might be an avalanche or shifting ice. Then, with dawning horror, he saw movement near the base of the spire. A massive shape peeled away from the ice, impossibly large and pale. Eddard's eyes went wide. It looked like some monstrous undead beast, half fused with the glacier. The men around him gasped and drew back. The shape lifted, revealing what seemed to be the huge bones of a long-extinct creature. Perhaps a dragon or a monstrous Wyrm. Coils of frost clung to it, and twin orbs of blue flame burned where eyes might have been. It scraped the ice with enormous claws, letting out a roar that vibrated the glacier beneath them. Then it lumbered forward, heading for the captive column. Some White Walkers glided ahead, as if guiding the beast. "God save us," one ranger choked. "What is that?" No one had words. Eddard forced himself to remain calm. "Release the raven now. They need to know about whatever that thing is." The watcher nodded, prying open the cage. The raven flapped out into the night sky, a dark shape quickly swallowed by distance. Eddard prayed it would find its way to Corrin, and from there to Castle Black. The realm must know that the White Walkers had monstrous allies beyond anything they had yet faced. He motioned for the men to retreat step by careful step. Each second, Eddard feared the Whites or that hideous beast would look their way, but the White Walkers seemed preoccupied with forcing the captives forward. The huge undead Wyrm roared again, shaking snow from the glacial walls, then snaked its head down to sniff at the terrified prisoners. Eddard forced himself not to imagine what fate awaited them. At last, he and his band slipped back behind the ridge. Hara led them along a winding route until they were well out of sight, hearts still hammering. Only then did they allow themselves to breathe. Eddard huddled them in a circle. "We've done what we came for. The raven is on its way. Now we must try to reach Corrin alive and confirm the message. That creature is beyond anything we've seen. The White Walkers may plan to unleash it upon the wall." Faces paled at the thought. One of the watchers said, "Then we best pray the realm arrives quickly." No single fortress can hold against that. In solemn agreement, they began the long journey back, hearts heavy. Though they traveled by night, they didn't dare linger in the open, fearing that the White Walkers might send out searching parties. Over the next day, they evaded 2 groups of whites combing the snowfields. Each time, they nearly stumbled into detection. Eddard's tension never ceased, expecting at any moment a shriek of pursuit. But luck or the old gods favored them, and eventually they approached the region where Corrin's 1,000-man camp should be. What they found instead was a field of charred earth and twisted bodies. Smoke still rose from the remains of burned wagons. Eddard's stomach lurched as they crept among the wreckage, stepping over corpses of men from the Watch or from the northern levies. Many bodies showed signs of savage wounds or freezing from within. In places, the footprints of whites crisscrossed the area. Eddard recognized a battered banner with the stark direwolf half buried in the snow. The camp had been attacked in force. He dreaded the fate of Corrin and the survivors. They found a few living men near the edge, survivors of the massacre. Most were gravely wounded, drifting in and out of consciousness. Eddard knelt by one man, carefully lifting his head. What happened? He asked, voice shaking. The soldier coughed, blood staining his lips. They? White Walkers, a big push. We tried to hold them. Some escaped south. Corrin might still live. But the whites came from both sides. No time. Then they left. Like it was a message. Eddard's heart sank. They wanted to show they can destroy us whenever they choose. Did they mention a giant beast? The soldier shook his head weakly. Didn't see. But the White Walkers were many. So many. We couldn't. He trailed off, eyes glazing. Eddard squeezed his hand, feeling the life slip away. A cold fury rose in him at the cruelty of these demons that walked like men of ice. Hara surveyed the devastation, lipsy. Yearling in disdain. Your men must have scattered, some perhaps still alive. Eddard stood slowly. Yes. But no sign of Corrin or my brother. They were to remain here. They must have retreated. We'll search for them. He paused, scanning the horizon, trying not to let despair crush him. The White Walkers had responded to the infiltration near the spire by annihilating the forward camp. If the Raven had reached them in time, maybe they still got word to Castle Black, but Eddard couldn't be sure. Over the next hours, they combed the outskirts of the battlefield, finding pockets of survivors in hiding. Some had fled into the woods or hunkered in ravines. They located about 100 men in total, scattered, some wounded. Among them, Eddard was relieved to see Corrin half-hand, leaning on his sword, a bloody rag tied around his head. Corrin gave a grim nod when Eddard approached, as though seeing a ghost. I thought you might be lost too, Lord Stark. The others attacked at dawn, no warning. They came with a horde of whites, at least 2 White Walkers. Some men fought valiantly, but we were overwhelmed. I gave the order to break out in small groups. Bolton's men from the Dreadfort took one route, some from House Serwyn another. I don't know how many made it. Eddard's voice was taut. Benjen? Was he among the survivors? Corrin grimaced. He was last I saw. He helped me rally a small group, but the whites separated us. He said he would try to lead a breakout to the west. I pray he succeeded. The mention of Bolton's men sparked a flicker of alarm in Eddard. Roose Bolton's loyalty had always been shaped by opportunity, though he had thus far supported the cause. He could only hope they still stood united in the face of the White Walkers. We must gather all survivors and move south, Corrin. The White Walkers have a monstrous beast in their service, a huge undead WIRM. We send a raven, but who knows if it got through. The realm must be warned. Corrin nodded. Agreed. Gather the wounded, salvage what supplies we can. We should start at once. The others might be near. In the aftermath, Eddard's group and the scattered survivors formed a smaller column, perhaps 150 strong, limping south under Corrin's guidance. Hara and his wildlings hovered on the periphery, clearly unwilling to march deeper into Neeler territory, but also not wanting to remain in the path of certain doom. Eddard was grateful that at least some of them stayed, adding eyes and expertise. The days that followed tested every shred of endurance. They had minimal food, many injured to care for, and near-constant fear that whites might strike again. More than once, they spotted distant shapes tracking them, but apparently the White Walkers held off a final attack. Perhaps they had proven their point. At length, after an arduous trek that left half the men frostbitten and delirious, they saw the dark line of the wall on the horizon. Even from afar, that barrier of ice and stone offered a sense of relief. They pressed on, forging through the last miles. Eddard's heart clenched with worry over Benjen, but he had found no trace of his brother among the survivors. Still, hope refused to die within him. Perhaps Benjen had escaped by some other route. As they neared the gates, horns sounded. Archers peered down from the ramparts, calling questions. Eddard shouted back, identifying himself. After tense moments, the gates opened. They stumbled inside, greeted by men in black cloaks. Among the onlookers in the courtyard, Eddard spotted King Robert, who strode forward, face etched with tension. The king's gaze swept the battered column. Gods, Ned, he muttered. We heard rumors of disaster. What happened? Eddard gestured wearily. We found the White Walker's lair, the Spear of Night. They have a monstrous undead beast. They attacked our camp in retaliation. Many were lost. I do not know who survived. Did you receive my raven? Robert's expression darkened. Yes. Tywin brought it to me. We've begun preparing the entire host to march. If that spire is truly the center of their power, we must break it for good. He paused, scanning the column. Where's Benjen? Where's Corrin's 1,000? Corrin stepped in, voice hoarse. Scattered or slain, your grace. This is all that remains of them. Lord Stark's brother was last seen leading a breakout. We don't know his fate. Robert closed his eyes in dismay, then placed a reassuring hand on Eddard's shoulder. I'm sorry, Ned. Perhaps he will yet return. Eddard swallowed hard, exhaustion and grief threatening to overwhelm him. Perhaps. For now, we must press on. Their threat is greater than ever. We cannot hesitate. Robert nodded fiercely. Then we shall not. Rest as you can, but tomorrow we call the banners. Tywin and I have gathered more reinforcements. Word from Eastwatch says the Tully men stand ready. The Great John is likewise prepared at the Shadow Tower. We march in full strength to that spire, no matter the cost. Eddard exhaled. We'd best hurry. Each day they grow stronger. I fear we cannot face that WIRM with ordinary steel. Robert's eyes held a determined flame. Then we'll bring every cask of wildfire, every dragonglass blade, and the best of my knights. We'll gather the might of Westeros in one unstoppable wave. The others shall learn that living men do not kneel to fear, nor to winter's blight. Men parted to let them pass. Eddard limped through the courtyard, battered in body and spirit, but a flicker of resolve still burned in him. They had discovered the White Walker's heart, a place older than memory. Now, if the realm united, they might deliver a final blow. The cost would be unimaginable, but if they failed, there would be no realm left to protect. Eddard gazed up at the sky, snow drifting in lazy flakes. He silently vowed to find Benjen or avenge him and to see this war to its bitter end. One more push, one final campaign. The living would stand or fall together. In the days that followed, Castle Black became a hive of mobilization. Word went out by Raven to Eastwatch, the Shadow Tower, Winterfell, even as far as the newly arrived Tully and Lannister forces in the southern approach. More men poured in by the day. Some had marched for weeks in the cold. Others arrived by ship at Eastwatch and traveled west. Robert hammered out the final strategy with Tywin, Hoster Tully, and the Lord Commander. Eddard, still recovering from his ordeal, provided crucial details of the route to the Spear of Night. They would assemble the largest army in living memory, tens of thousands strong, and strike north in multiple columns, converging at a designated staging area. Speed was essential. They could not tarry in the face of the White Walker's black magic. Every smith worked day and night forging arrowheads from obsidian lumps shipped from Dragonstone. Pyromancers arrived from King's Landing with barrels of wildfire. Supply lines were established. The Watchers patrolled the skies, ever mindful of the possibility that the White Walkers might attempt to break the wall in a direct assault. Amidst the frenzy, Eddard found scarce time to dwell on Benjen's fate. Occasionally, he questioned survivors or new arrivals, hoping someone had seen his brother, but no one had. In fleeting private moments, he allowed himself to imagine that Benjen had escaped west, perhaps rejoining the Great John at the Shadow Tower. It was a thin hope, but he clung to it. When the day came for the grand host to march, the sight was staggering. Thousands of soldiers thronged the area south of the wall, lined in ranks that stretched for leagues. Banners snapped in the icy wind, Baratheon stags, Lannister lions, Tully trouts, Stark direwolves, Manderly mermen, and a score more. King Robert, astride a massive warhorse, took position at the head, clad in plate that had been newly reinforced with obsidian studs on the gauntlets. Tywin Lannister stood on his right, face grim. Hoster Tully commanded a flank, and various northern lords arranged their men. The Lord Commander contributed a large contingent of Night's Watch brothers, though some remained to guard the wall. Eddard rode near Robert, though his body still ached from wounds that had barely healed. He was determined to see this through. The plan was for 3 major columns to advance beyond the wall, each carrying a portion of the supplies, and meet at a halfway point. From there, they would push toward the spire in a single overwhelming wave, using dragonglass and wildfire to combat the undead. Siege engines were adapted to fling not just stones, but casks of fire. If the monstrous WRM appeared, they would hurl wildfire at it. It was a desperate gamble, but nothing else could be done. They set out under a leaden sky. Horns echoed. The massive columns of men, horses, and supply wagons trundled through the gate into the wild beyond. The watchers on the walls peered after them in silence, aware that the fate of the realm marched with that host. Eddard felt a surge of grim determination. This was the final stand. Win or lose, Westeros would never be the same. Days of marching tested the discipline of the combined army. Snow squalls slowed progress and the land offered little forage. They had to rely on the supplies brought with them. Occasional glimpses of whites in the distance kept the men on edge, but no large battles erupted. Perhaps the White Walkers withdrew, preparing for a final confrontation near their stronghold. Scouts reported scattered groups of wildlings who either fled or cautiously offered help, as Hara's clan had done. Robert accepted any who would fight, ignoring the usual animosity. The men trudged on, step by grueling step. At last, they reached the designated staging area, a broad plain just south of the deeper glaciers. The three columns reunited, forming one immense army. Tens of thousands of men arrayed themselves, building a temporary fortification of snow and wood. Fires blazed across the camp. Eddard could not walk from one end to the other without taking most of a day. Robert gathered his commanders in a huge marquee tent where a map of the Spear of Night region was spread upon a table. Eddard pointed out the route, cautioning them about crevasses and hidden ridges. They decided to march in a wide front so the White Walkers could not easily flank them. The center, commanded by Robert, Tywin, and Eddard, would drive straight for the spire. Hoster Tully would hold the left while the Great John anchored the right. The watchwords were discipline and caution. When the White Walkers appeared, the men with Dragonglass and Wildfire would lead the charge, supported by archers who rained obsidian shafts. Cavalry would be used sparingly as the terrain was poor. If the undead WIRM came, the siege engines and pyromancers would concentrate on bringing it down. That night, Robert paced outside the marquee, hammer in hand. Eddard stood with him, listening to the wind. The king's breath swirled in pale clouds. "This is it," Robert muttered. "Tomorrow or the next day we meet them. I wonder how many we'll lose. All I know is we must break them or die trying." Eddard inclined his head. "Aye. There is no retreat from this. If we fail, the entire realm is lost." Robert looked up at the sky, which was free of stars, choked by storm clouds. "I wish I had your stoicism, Ned. My heart feels like it's beating out of my chest. Yet I'll not show fear to the men." Eddard allowed a faint grim smile. "I'm no less anxious. But we'll face it together." The next morning, the entire host formed ranks, shifting inexorably north. The vantage of tens of thousands of men in arms was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Some sang marching songs, though the cold soon stilled most voices. The Great John could be heard bellowing in the distance, rallying the right flank. Horn calls echoed across the plain. Eventually, the leading ranks crested a ridge, revealing the final approach to the glacier. Eddard saw the Spear of Night in the far distance, rising like a ghastly beacon. The men near him muttered curses or prayers at the sight. They advanced in cautious increments. Scouts rode out, reporting that whites gathered in large formations ahead, scattered over miles of territory. The watchers with keen eyes noted pale shapes gliding among them, White Walkers possibly in the hundreds. Eddard's gut clenched at the numbers. The host around him murmured in awe or dread, but they had come too far to turn back. Robert signaled the horns. The front lines shifted into battle formation. Siege engines trundled forward, escorted by foot soldiers. Archers lined up, dragging caskets of obsidian arrows. The pyromancers prepared barrels of wildfire. Eddard rode beside Robert and Tywin, scanning the sea of undead that stretched toward the spire. A hush fell. Then the White Walkers let out a collective shriek, and the whites lurched forward, moaning like damned souls. The final battle began. Drums thudded in the living army. Archers loosed their first volley of obsidian-tipped shafts, black streaks across the gray sky. When they struck the whites, dozens collapsed. Another volley followed. Then the whites closed the distance, crashing into the forward lines. Spearmen stabbed with dragonglass-tipped pikes, swordsmen hacked at grasping limbs, men cried out as claws raked flesh. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Thousands clashed in a cacophony of shrieks and roars. White Walkers glided through the chaos, freezing steel weapons with a touch. But the living responded with volleys of arrows aimed at them, forcing some to retreat or vanish in swirling frost. Robert bellowed for the catapults to fire. Wildfire soared in arcs, splashing green flame over knots of undead, incinerating them in ghastly splendor. The stench was horrific. Some White Walkers conjured blasts of ice to douse the flames, but many whites perished screaming. Eddard directed archers to concentrate on any White Walker they could see. More than once, a well-placed dragonglass arrow shattered one of the pale fiends. The men cheered, pushing forward in that area. Tywin's cavalry, minimal though it was, performed short, sharp charges, scattering whites at the flanks, then retreating before they could be surrounded. The entire plain became a swirling melee of steel, flame, and ice. Corpses littered the ground, some of them rising again if not promptly destroyed or burned. Despite heavy losses, the living forced their way forward, yard by yard, toward the Spear of Night. The Grecians' war cries could be heard on the right, and Eddard glimpsed Tully banners pressing on the left. The White Walkers responded by summoning more whites from the rear. An unending mass. Eddard realized with a chill that the White Walkers must have drawn the dead from every wildling village, every lost battle. They had an army that might rival any mortal host in raw numbers. The question was whether the living could break through by coordinating Dragonglass and Wildfire effectively. So far, they were holding their own, but exhaustion and fear took their toll. Then, from the direction of the spire, a colossal roar tore across the battlefield. Every combatant froze for a heartbeat, living and undead alike. Eddard felt dread curl in his stomach. Emerging from behind the ice ridges came the monstrous WIRM, rearing its skeletal head. Vast ribs crusted with frost rose and fell as if it still breathed. Blue fire glowed in its cavernous eye sockets. White Walkers clung to its massive back or guided it from the ground. It slithered across the glacier with frightening speed, each step shaking the earth. The men gasped in horror. Robert stared at it with wide eyes, then whirled to the pyromancers. Ready the scorpions? Huge ballistae had been fitted with canisters of wildfire on their bolts, but it was a tricky contrivance. The WIRM roared again, exhaling a blast of freezing mist that cascaded across the living ranks. Men caught in it turned to solid ice, shattering if they fell. Eddard watched in horror as entire blocks of spearmen froze in place. Some catapults launched barrels of wildfire at the beast, but it slithered aside with unnerving agility. Its skeletal tail whipped around, smashing men into pulp. The White Walkers on its back hurled shards of ice, impaling archers from a distance. Panic rippled through the living army. Steady! Robert roared, riding back and forth, smashing whites with his hammer. Hold your ground. Archers, aim for the beast's head. Light your arrows with wildfire if you can. Eddard tried to direct men toward the siege engines that had a chance of harming the WIRM. A catapult fired a flaming barrel. The WIRM hissed, raising a massive forelimb to swat it aside, resulting in a partial explosion that scorched the beast's bony flank. A chunk of frost-laden bone cracked away, revealing rotted sinew beneath. The creature roared in pain or rage, turning its skull-like visage on the catapult. A breath of icy doom followed, freezing the catapult and its crew, who shattered under the next swipe. Men cried out, scrambling to keep their distance. The living fought on multiple fronts now. Whites pressed heavily from all sides, while the WIRM rampaged through the center. Tywin Lannister, grim and calm, led a group of knights in a desperate charge, seeking to distract the beast. Half of them were slain instantly by a sweep of its claws. Others managed to fling wildfire grenades, which clung to the creature's ribcage and burst in green flame. The WIRM shrieked, thrashing about, crushing friend and foe alike. The White Walkers on its back either jumped clear or were thrown off. One soared through the air, landing in a knot of swordsmen who swarmed it with dragonglass. Eddard spurred his own horse, trying to get close enough for a decisive blow, but the WIRM was monstrous. He realized that only a well-placed siege bolt might truly finish it. Robert galloped by, face alight with battle fury, hammer raised. Ned, the scorpions are set near the back lines. We need to draw that beast in range. Get it to open its maw or raise its head. Then we'll drive a wildfire bolt down its throat. Eddard swallowed. I'll try. He turned, rallying men. Archers, loose on the creature's face. Make it rear up. They obeyed, sending a flurry of dragonglass arrows at the WIRM's skull. Some stuck, some bounced off bone. A few lodged in the empty eye sockets, but apparently did not kill it. The WIRM flinched, roaring, then unleashed another wave of freezing breath that turned a swath of archers to ice. Eddard felt a sting of despair. How could they slay such a horror? Tywin's voice rose in command near the scorpions. Steady, steady, wait for an opening. The scorpion crews adjusted their aim, wildfire bolts trembling on the edges of the siege engines. If they missed, it might be their only shot wasted. Eddard spurred his horse around, ignoring the whites clawing at his boots. He saw Robert ride close to the WIRM's flank, heave his hammer, and smash it into a protruding rib. The blow cracked bone, sending shards flying. The WIRM howled, whipped its tail, and sent Robert's horse crashing down. The king tumbled free in a clang of armor. Eddard's heart lurched. Was Robert killed? He rode to the spot, cutting down a white in his path. Robert rose, battered but alive, blood seeping from his temple. I'm fine, The king growled, staggering. "We need that bolt now." The WYRM reared up, opening its jaws wide, preparing another breath. Tywin saw his moment. He roared, "Loose!" The scorpion's heavy arm snapped forward, launching a thick shaft trailing a small cask of wildfire. The blazing projectile whistled through the air. The WRM's jaws parted, an azure glow gathering there. Then the bolt aimed into the creature's mouth and exploded in a searing ball of green flame. The WYRM's head snapped back, a shudder rippling down its entire spine. An unearthly shriek tore from its throat. Flames licked along its jaw and neck as the undead beast writhed in agony. Another scorpion bolt soared in, striking just below the first. The explosion ripped the WYRM's lower jaw clean off. Frost and black ichor spewed forth, sizzling in contact with the wildfire. The monstrous creature stumbled, half its skull disintegrating. Its tail flailed wildly, flattening wights and men alike. Then, with a final roar, it collapsed onto the ice, cracking the ground beneath its bulk. Bones splintered, green flames devouring its core. The White Walkers that had circled it let out shrieks, whether of fury or despair, Eddard could not tell. He realized with a surge of triumph that they had slain the WYRM. A ragged cheer erupted among the living, echoing across the battlefield. But the fight was not over. The Spear of Night still towered ahead and countless wights swarmed. Even as the WYRM's remains burned, the White Walkers called the undead forward, seeking to bury the living army in sheer numbers. Yet the living now had renewed hope. They had slain the greatest weapon of the others. Robert rallied the men, smashing wights with unstoppable fury while Tywin calmly reorganized the lines. Hoster Tully's archers rained down obsidian from the left flank, cutting swathes through the horde. The Greyjohn's right flank hammered in a wild charge, roaring northern battle cries. Eddard fought with ice in hand, guiding small pockets of men to thrust deeper into the undead lines. Each White Walker that tried to hold them back found itself targeted by multiple obsidian blades or arrows. The living pressed on, unstoppable now, forging a path toward the spire itself. At last, the White Walkers began to waver, their illusions of invincibility shattered. Some retreated, gliding away across the glacier, leaving the Whites to fight mindlessly. Others tried to conjure walls of ice, but catapults lobbed wildfire into their positions. The men advanced relentlessly. Eddard glimpsed the spire's base, those archways leading into icy corridors. White Walkers vanished within, presumably defending some inner sanctum. Robert pointed with his hammer. "Forward! We end this!" Like an avalanche, the living army stormed the spire. Whites clustered at the entrances, but the volume of men overwhelmed them. Dragonglass-tipped spears and swords flashed in the torchlight. Torches set the archways ablaze, melting the edges of the ice. Eddard and Robert led the charge into a cavernous tunnel where the walls glowed with eerie reflections. They found White Walkers waiting, a final stand. The fighting was fierce, swords clashed with crystalline blades, men fell to freezing strikes, but the White Walkers also perished under combined assaults. One by one, they shattered into shards of ice. The surviving Whites collapsed. The entire spire trembled as if the magic sustaining it began to fail. Finally, Eddard found himself in a chamber near the center. An altar of black ice dominated the space, etched with runes that hurt the eyes. A group of White Walkers encircled it, chanting in a language that sounded like wind through cracks. Robert, Tywin, and a handful of men burst in. A savage melee erupted. Eddard struck down a walker, ice crystals scattering. Robert hammered another into fragments. A swirl of freezing wind threatened to blind them, but Tywin hurled a wildfire pot at the altar. It exploded, green flame washing over the runes. The White Walkers shrieked, their chant broken. The spire shook violently. Cracks ran through the walls. Eddard drove ice into the last Walker's chest, feeling it dissolve under the blade. The wind died. Outside, the host set the spire ablaze with more wildfire, pummeling it with catapults. A deep groan echoed within. Eddard shouted for the men to retreat. They rushed out, dragging wounded with them. Chunks of ice fell from the ceilings, entire sections of the spire collapsing. Once the living were clear, the entire structure began to crumble. Pillars of ice toppled, and the ground split. With a roar like thunder, the spire collapsed into itself, sending a shockwave across the glacier. The men whooped in triumph as the ancient edifice shattered. The Whites across the battlefield that still stood jerked and collapsed as though their animating force had been severed. White Walkers who lingered outside tried to flee, but the men hunted them down in the open. Some might escape into the desolate north, but their primary seat of power was destroyed. The realm's combined might had shattered the White Walkers' fortress, their monstrous WIRM, and their unholy altar. The final death toll was enormous, but victory belonged to the living. Exhausted men slumped to their knees on the battlefield, some weeping with relief, others calling out for lost friends. Robert, battered and spattered in blood, lifted his hammer high in a final salute. Tywin, face grimly satisfied, surveyed the ruin. Hoster Tully cradled a wound in his arm but was alive. Eddard stood amid the wreckage, every muscle aching, tears threatening to spill. It was done. The ancient enemy had been driven back into myth. If any White Walkers remained, they were leaderless, scattered. Westeros had survived. In the hours after, men formed search parties to aid the wounded, bury the dead, and ensure no whites lurked. Eddard wandered among them, searching desperately for some sign of Benjen. He found none, only more bodies. His heart sank, but he refused to abandon hope. Perhaps his brother was somewhere else on the battlefield or had never made it this far. Finally, as dusk fell, the last skirmishes ended and the men began to build great pyres to burn the fallen, especially any that might risk reanimation. Green and orange flames lit the glacier in a haunting glow. It was near one such pyre that a grizzled ranger came to Eddard tugging along a wounded figure in black. "My lord found him near the edge of the field," the ranger said. Eddard's heart soared, Benjen, half-frozen, leaning on a staff. His face was bruised, but his eyes were bright. Eddard rushed to embrace him, and Benjen clung back, sobbing in relief. "I made it with a group of watchers," Benjen whispered. "We got pinned by whites. We heard the battle from afar but couldn't reach you in time." "Is it over?" Eddard nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "It is. The spire is destroyed. The White Walkers are broken. We've won." Benjen sagged, a tremulous smile crossing his lips. "Then it was worth it." Eddard held him tighter, no words left. Around them, the battered armies of Westeros gathered, forging the dawn of a new era in the ashes of war. Robert Baratheon would return south a king triumphant, Tywin Lannister would nurse his ambitions in a realm delivered from doom, and Eddard Stark would go home to Winterfell with his brother alive. The cost in blood and sorrow was beyond measure, but they had halted the long night before it swallowed the world. And so the snows fell gently over a battlefield laced with the lingering green glow of wildfire and the fading echoes of shattered ice. In that stillness, with the White Walkers vanquished and their monstrous army scattered, the living remembered both their fragility and their courage. Men of every station, lords, knights, wildlings, sworn brothers, small folk, had stood shoulder to shoulder and driven back the nightmares from beyond the wall. Legends would grow from this day, and the realm, though scarred, would endure. The winds carried away the final moans of the dead, leaving only the steady, hopeful breath of those who had survived. Eddard Stark closed his eyes, letting the cold air wash over him, and thought of home.